People who like to explore abandoned buildings. What was the biggest "F this, I'm out" moment you had while exploring? In my undergrad, I took a forensic anthropology class, and our professor, later my graduate supervisor, told us a story of how they would bury pigs dressed in women's clothing and underwear to study how the clothing breaks down during decomp. After one such study, they just left the pigs in place and I guess forgot about them? I don't know. Anyways, the story goes that the location they used was just outside the city and was due to be developed into a shopping center. Needless to say, the developers found the pigs, said WTF, and called the police. Luckily, my professor is also the forensic anthropologist for the police and was able to explain things to them pretty quickly. Weird day for the contractors, I guess. Story 2. Several years ago, a man was murdered in the city I was working in, and parts of his body were turning up at various locations. I think his hand and foot had been found and a week had passed. I'm an architectural designer, and I was surveying an abandoned chapel that was slated to be renovated into condos. It was apparent that homeless people had been squatting in the chapel, but I wasn't sure how recently they had been there. When I went into the basement though, it was clear someone was either there or had just left based on the smell. There were no lights due to the power being cut, and I didn't stick around long enough to see if anyone was currently occupying the space. 2 days later, someone reported that they found the torso and the head of a murdered man in a building attached to the chapel. I had been too freaked out by the smell in the basement to continue on to the attached building, but I'm almost certain I would have been the one to find the body. Story 3. As kids, we would walk this quarter-mile railway tunnel near where I grew up. There were no tracks, but it was next to 2 live tunnels, so there was a slight element of danger. That and the fact it was trespassing, I guess, and railway workmen on transport police could catch us at any moment. So as you can imagine, it was dark. Real dark in the middle, but towards the end there was enough light to barely see. One day we took an old school pal down there, and after walking the length, almost at the end of the tunnel, just as it was beginning to get light, he stopped to look down a large uncovered square 3-foot by 3-foot manhole. No, he didn't fall in, but after a flash of brief confusion, he took in a deep breath and screamed, then immediately started sprinting for daylight. "Oh crap! Effing run!" he screams. Naturally, without question, we ran, having a hard time catching him up. At the mouth of the tunnel, we stopped, all out of breath. "What the heck? What's wrong? What did you see?" we asked. His face was pure white and shaky, barely able to speak. He said, "There was something down there, looking up at me." Now, this buddy was and still is a good friend of mine, but back then he wasn't known for not being the sharpest tool in the drawer. Instantly, we had an idea what just happened, but slowly we returned to open the manhole. Then, as the 4 of us stood around this hole looking down, sure enough, reflected in the still water about 5 feet down this freaking hole, was our 4 faces looking back up at us. Story 4. Exploring an abandoned manor with some friends. We'd been drinking and smoking and thought it would be cool. The ground floor entrances were covered with bricks, so we had to enter through the first floor, 8-foot height, using an improvised ladder made of old trash and wood pieces. It was quite unstable and hard to climb, and we were 5 or 6 people. Being the only way out and knowing how slow it was, I was on edge the whole time. We were exploring the floor, cool glass ceilings, lots of debris, but suddenly we find a room filled with plastic containers with pink and brown liquids. Some friends decide to explore the ground floor, which was pitch black and involved going down a broken staircase missing several steps. They heard someone coughing in the dark and felt several people moving in the darkness as their eyes got used to it. At this point, I was hearing someone slowly walking in a room on the first floor, carefully stepping over the broken glass on the floor to not make noise, which was really creepy. We got the F away, and on our way out, we saw a roughed up man with bloodshot eyes leaving a shack outside the house and staring at us. I still shiver when I remember his look. Probably just some junkies living there, but for overly high 15-year-olds, it was scary as F. Story 5. I've been many places in the tri-state area and have experienced floors that are decaying. Once almost fell, thankfully was a very small drop. Needles, animal corpses, etc. One time at a prison in New Jersey, I saw a cell that was decked out with decorated doll houses. and you could tell someone was staying there. The creepiest experience I ever had was about 6 years ago. I was in an abandoned hospital in a residential part of NYC, which had been abandoned less than a decade prior to our visit. Despite this, it was not a well-known location. We went at night and were exploring the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th floors all without issue and in total silence. There was little to no graffiti and everything was left: patient records and tissue samples, medicines, medical equipment. As we reached the 4th floor, we passed a random room that said, "No explosive gases can be used in this room." I read the sound aloud, and we immediately heard a huge thud coming from inside that exact room. My blood ran cold and I literally froze because I felt that someone in that room was making themselves known. We ran out of there and heard slamming doors as we went down all the stairs. I have not been back there since, and it's now been sold and is being renovated into a housing complex. I still wonder what would have happened if we went into the room. Story 6. Wow, I can't believe I have a place to tell this story. When I was in middle school, we went upstate in the summer. There was an abandoned house in the woods we explored. Top floor was pretty pristine. The beds were made and drawers, closets shut with stuff neatly arranged inside. There were bats. The lower you went, the more disordered. The basement and garage was in a complete disarray. Books and random crap thrown around. Beer cans and used condoms. We went to the far end of the house where the wall partially collapsed, and that's when we saw the bear. Foolishly ran with all of our might. Thankfully, the house is between us, and bear's lack of interest is why I'm typing this. Story 7. Broke into an abandoned house in the village I grew up in England back when I was a teenager. Maybe 15 years ago now. Was with a couple friends but broke off by myself and ventured upstairs. When I turned at the top of the stairs, I saw a figure standing in the darkness, just staring at me. I bolted out of the building as quickly as I could, and my friends heard me and panicked. They weren't far behind. Went back there a couple of weeks later with a bigger group to prove my story, and to my embarrassment, it was a tall mirror at the top of the stairs. The figure I saw was me. Not my proudest moment. Story 8. I do urban exploring quite frequently, and nothing ever makes us leave instantly apart from dodgy floors or squatters. However, 5 years ago, me and my friends explored a derelict farmhouse with outbuildings which had evidently been left for decades with the state it was in. After having a look around the place and finding nothing but empty buildings, we looked inside what appeared to be an old stable. Inside was literally hundreds of empty tins of cat food, some nooses tied to a beam, and a fairly new pair of scissors with a brownish crust covering the blades. The smell was putrid. We ventured further into the building and noticed on the floor was cat tails and a few cat paws which had been dismembered and left on the floor. We swiftly exited, and on our way out, picked up and pulled up onto the side of the farm. Bearing in mind it was surrounded by woods and fields with no track leading to it, with 3 men standing in the bed. Needless to say, we got out of there as quick as we could and haven't seen or heard anything about it. The farm went on the market and sold earlier this year, so it would be interesting to see who previously owned it. Story 9. My friends and I were exploring an abandoned military housing complex at night. It was in pretty bad shape, but there were lots of interesting things to see. We almost peed ourselves a couple times because of mannequins behind doors and stuff. There was also a neat art installation with records hanging from the ceiling. Anyway, we climbed up some stairs to the tallest part of the building. We saw some faint light coming from under a door. Somehow, the door had been booby-trapped, and as soon as my friend opened it, there was a crash and a cinder block on a rope that came swinging out of the open door and just missed us. I got a spilled second look inside where I saw a small fire, a mattress on the ground, and then a man moving quickly towards us. He was silhouetted by the light, so I couldn't make out what he looked like or what exactly he was holding, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I yelled, "Run!" and we bolted out of there as fast as our legs could carry us. Story 10. I used to walk around an abandoned building near a forest which was initially a child hospital in the 70s, a refugee housing in the 90s, and a language school for Chinese students till 2007. Since then, it's been abandoned. The students left quite suddenly, so I found diaries, certificates, and even food. It was interesting since the place was not vandalized at that time. Once I was inside the building again when I realized someone else was walking upstairs. I never left this place so fast, jumped over the gate, and headed to my car. When I reached there, a police car stopped in front of the building and 2 officers jumped over the fence to enter the building. No idea what was there, but sometimes I wonder if I avoided more than just a report for trespassing. Story 11. Been bit 3 times. They ain't that bad. Uncomfortable, yes, but unless you're old, a baby, or have pre-existing conditions that'd be worsened by the venom, you'll be fine. My remedy is some Advil and alcohol. works like a charm. Edit. As someone mentioned below, seek medical advice. I called Poison Control and they asked me a few questions and recommended that Advil, Tylenol that I mentioned. Monitor yourself and your symptoms. You know your body better than anyone. Seek advice first, make a plan, and never think you're too tough to go to the doctor for a spider bite. I'm just saying, in my experience and those of others I've talked to, most people won't need medical attention and can safely wait it out. I live in the US, so the cost of a doctor visit or ER visit was heavily factored into my decision there. Use your best judgment and try not to get bit in the first place. They're easy to avoid. It's just part of my job to be around them, and therefore, I'm at a lot more risk than someone who isn't getting paid to find them and kill them. Story 12. A friend and I were exploring an abandoned mental facility that had been purchased by a large computer co. here in Silicon Valley. The compound was massive. It had its own sheriff, slaughterhouse, industrial mechanic shop, on-site homes for the employees, everything a small town would have, in addition to the hospital, school, and a beautiful mansion. All but the mansion were being demolished. The hospital had some creepy, though typical of the time, rooms and equipment, etc. Went through every house, storage unit, outbuilding on the property, and found some amazing things, with nothing negative of any kind happening. Then we went to the library. We went up the spiral staircase into the belfry, I think that's what it's called. From the minute we entered the building, I was nervous and uncomfortable. On the way up, we'd passed rooms full of books, and were going to check them out on the way out. There was no one else on the property, and the staircase was made of narrow metal stairs. From the top of the stairs, you could see all the way to the bottom. We both heard footsteps coming up the stairs, but when we looked, no one was there. We looked in all the rooms and all the way down and nothing. There was no other way in or out. Suddenly, I was filled with terror and I've never felt before or since. I'm not religious, but began praying for my life. We left immediately, and the feeling stopped once we left the building. My friend felt something, she said, but not to the level I did. No idea what happened there, but it was truly bizarre. Story 13. There was a coffin, a real coffin. We were in an abandoned factory that some rich family had owned, and there was this room with a bunch of personal stuff and letters from the 50s, furniture, old photographs, clothes, even booze. Like someone's home had just been put in there. In the middle of it all was a coffin. I swear, the room was gloomy. It was a late summer afternoon, no power, and we didn't have flashlights. My friend was like, "We gotta open this coffin. We can't leave unless we do. We gotta!" And straight up lifted the lid. A sweet smell came from the darkness. When my grandmother died, I was the one to find the corpse, and I remember that one quite well. So my heart skipped a couple of beats. The coffin was full of candles. They did have a sweet smell. Story 14. Used to F around this massive property that consisted of 3 gigantic factory buildings right next to a big strip mall plaza. It was pretty popular because the cops never cared enough to patrol, so the whole place was completely covered in really amazing graffiti. Once our group of 9 visited just after a tropical storm that knocked out power in most of the state. We thought it'd be sick to go stargaze up on the roof. To get up, you have to crawl through this partially collapsed passageway and then climb 3 stories up an old ladder. A few minutes after we all got up, a waterlogged section of roof started collapsing, and we all had to scramble on top of each other to get down the ladder, with a few people basically falling part of the way down. We managed to crawl out of the passageway just as some metal parts of the roof started crashing down. Decided we probably shouldn't stick around and find out how much more water damage the storm had done. Still continued to visit for several years until the property changed hands, and a security guard was hired to watch it, but never dared to go on the roof again, and definitely never went after rainstorms. Story 15. When I was in high school, me and a bunch of friends piled into my friend's car and drove up to some abandoned houses near our town. The houses were bought by a big company to tear them down to build more office space, but the project was abandoned, and the houses were never torn down. They'd been empty for about 20 years at that point. I really didn't want to go, but I had just gotten into the cool crowd and I wanted to fit in, so I went along. The houses were falling apart, covered in graffiti and trash, and it was dead silent and pitch dark out. The only light we had were our cell phone flashlights. Most of us were terrified, but a few of the older boys were being rowdy and making a lot of noise. I told them to shut up because I didn't want the cops to come, and I knew this was also a hotspot for squatters, and I didn't want us to get robbed and or murdered. The whole time I kept feeling like I was hearing crap behind me, but I tried to brush it off thinking it was just my imagination. About the 3rd house we went to, I found an old Victorian doll, covered in dust and cobwebs on the staircase. I don't know why, but I picked it up to look at it. It was creepy as all F, one eye missing and matted hair and torn clothing. I quickly put it down and walked away to continue exploring. A few minutes later, in dead silence, besides our footsteps creaking on the old wooden floors, we heard, "Mama!" in a soft child's voice, coming from the doll. I looked at my friends, they looked at me, and we hightailed it back to the car and sped away, never went back after that. Edit. This was either a doll with a pull string or you pressed its belly to talk. I don't remember, but no one was anywhere near the doll when it went off. I don't really believe in ghosts, so my logical mind wants to think that I probably just knocked it when I put it down, or it was displaced a bit with all of us walking around the house, but it was still creepy as F nonetheless. And yes, I am female, which made it 10 times creepier. Hey, female, male, I don't care what you are. Something like that happens, I'm finding some holy water and make it an anti-creepy doll circle or something. Story 16. There's an abandoned old cabin in the middle of the woods that's near my house. I believe it's from the early 1900s and it's falling apart and blocked off by the rangers. But they don't really patrol this forest, so it's easy to jump the gate and hike up to the cabin. I decided to explore one day and climbed up the rotting deck to the main cabin. It was so dark and musty with broken glass and acorns everywhere. I went deeper into the cabin to explore the different rooms. As I was walking around, I started to hear a rustling noise. Me, being an idiot, I started to walk closer to the sound. I moved a rotting board over to the side and an effing squirrel leapt out and attached itself to my sweater. I start screaming and grabbed the squirrel with my hands and threw it off me. I ran out of that cabin and never looked back. I still pass the cabin when I hike with my dog, but I've learned my lesson. It belongs to the forest now. Story 17. Had just helped my friend leave the abandoned World War II fort, which is a mile down a private, fenced-off road that goes through a concrete works and has a difficult-to-cross moat, by giving him a leg up to the hole in the ceiling. He was up, and I couldn't reach it. Then, out of nowhere, 2 men come through a doorway and approach me asking me what I'm up to. My friend, luckily, heard them and got back down to make sure I was okay. Turns out they were paranormal investigators and were staying the night to observe and see if anything came through. They asked if I wanted to stay with them. We said no and effed off quickly. I was legitimately terrified. My other story is that I sort of pulled a woman in her late 40s when I was 20. She invited me back to hers and for some reason brought a friend. We get there and a guy is outside waiting for her, furious. She said it's her lodger. The 4 of us go in and continue drinking and the lodger seems like a nice enough guy. He tells me to pick some music. I put on The Promise by When in Rome, and the woman and the lodger start to argue. It's at this point he drops that he's her husband and he's sick of her bringing men back while he's in. I'm sitting there, listening to this effing song, watching 2 people in the main doorway of the room going mad at each other, and the exit is the other side of their argument. The other guy that came back with us slips out the door and gives me one of those, "I'm sorry, man," looks on his way out. Eventually, after the argument concluded, the husband stormed upstairs and the woman is crying in the doorway. I went over, consoled her for about 5 minutes, and then made my exit. It was so effing awkward. Later found out she's effed at least one of my uncles and my dad. Lucky escape. Story 18. Being near Sheffield, there are quite a few abandoned steelworks. A real diesel punk aesthetic going on. I'm not going to say where this one is for safety reasons you are about to read. There's scrap steel and iron stacked at one end of the building, rollers, a furnace, some offices, the sort of thing you see in a 1920-ish steelworks, proud of its 15-hour days, 6 days a week for boys and lads. Then, as we're stepping forward, the floor appears to be sagging. We weren't aware of any subsurface structure in this factory. Still, maybe it had boilers or something. In hindsight, we should have known something was amiss at this point, as the colors of the corrosion on the iron were different, blacks and greens. One of the group gets the idea to throw some of the scrap iron down a hole in the sagged area to see how deep it goes. There's a lot of abandoned medieval bell pit works and slant mines nearby as well, as being worked since antiquity for both ironstone and coal. When urbexing, we know to keep the heck away from the mines, as we're in an area known for damps. The characteristic metal on rock sound rings out several times, then some metal on metal clangs, and finally a muffled metal on rock thud. Wherever that scrap went, it was deep. The corroded metals near the sagged floor were telling us what it was: sulfates. Most probably telling us that mine damp was around. It seems the steelworks had been built atop an abandoned mine, knowingly or not. Knowing mine shafts rarely existed alone, we were very carefully and very quickly got the heck out of that building. Story 19. I was exploring with my parents in an abandoned Soviet small city where the soldiers and their families stayed. It was getting dark because of the coming storm. I found a basement and thought to just take a fast look into it. It was really dark, but I heard my mom saying on the other side of the basement corridor that she found something and I should see it. I just asked where she was, then I heard my mom again from behind telling me to hurry up because the storm is coming and it started to rain. I was 20 years old at the time, but I turned around and got the F out of there with tears rolling down my cheeks and shaking like there's no tomorrow. I told my mom and she said it's another reason to just leave ASAP. Story 20. The Hammock, Florida, 1976. I was 14 and had ridden south on A1A with buddies, one of which drove. We stopped at Marineland. Locals got in free at that time and got cokes from the snack bar at the north end of the park. We motored south and began exploring an old abandoned 2-story house. The back right room was full of women's shoes. They all appeared new. Odd. Upon a closer examination, there seemed to be only right-hand shoes. The room was 2 feet deep in footwear. If there were left-hand shoes in that room, we could not locate them. To be honest, we might have missed any left-handers though. We were being goofballs and not really searching all that hard. We then found a small dark burgundy velvet jewelry box. When we opened it, there was a glass eye in it. That was a bit creepy, but then we saw that the glass eye had a goat pupil in it. We were out of there. To this day, I remember the shiver that went down my spine. I mean, who makes a glass eye for a goat? Yikes. Story 21. Got into an old cement factory with a few friends 15 years ago. No smartphone, no fancy gadgets, just a halogen flashlight and each other. We walked around for hours. The basement was flooded and the water crystal clear. Everything heavy still in place. Surreal. Climbed the staircase at one end of the factory up to a room that had huge motors inside. Black filthy windows and a weird smell. Started to walk into the darkest area of the rooms up there and the smell got worse and worse. Found a smashed window pane for some air and light. Shouted for my mates to come to me so we could share the flashlight and look around properly. First mate comes up and freezes. Second mate, with the light already on and aimed straight at me, gagging and covering his face. Pigeons hanging from the walls and carcasses on the floor, a huge symbol scratched and painted on the walls. The windows black, probably from the blood of these poor birds. We noped out of that room pretty quick. F knows who had been there messing with birds like that. Turns out the smell was likely death and rotting animals. Story 22. We were finally going to explore the second floor. We went up the outside stairs. For context, it was an abandoned house, not a building, and we were facing the brick-sealed entrance, which had a hole where a person could fit. Out of nowhere, my mate's phone started playing loud music and he quickly turned it off. We looked at each other and laughed, not knowing what would follow. The second after, we were filled with relief. From the other side of the entrance, we heard a cough and a door creaking. My mate just turned to me and said, "Run!" And we did. Afterwards, we concluded it was probably just a homeless person living there, but we were never completely sure. Story 23. A couple years ago, I lived in Saudi Arabia. In Saudi, most foreigners like me lived in something called compounds. In these compounds, there were houses and there were swimming pools and football courts and all that kind of stuff. And inside, you could do what you like. There was this one old apartment block that had been abandoned for years and all of the guards said not to go into it. One day, me and my friends snuck in and went inside. It was really creepy. There was a staircase that went straight into a wall and the pictures were all weird and we were all super creeped out. We then went into an attic and then we heard 2 men talking. We got freaked the F out and ran. The next day we wanted to see it again and we were less shocked since we'd already seen it. We went back into that attic and it turned out it was 2 Bengali maintenance workers just chilling. Story 24. Not exactly what you asked for, but I'm gonna post, maybe someone remembers the video. A couple years ago, BuzzFeed's Unsolved Mysteries just started. I started watching expropriation videos. There was a video of this group of explorers. They went into woods, got into an old house, and went in and started exploring. On the second floor, there was an eerie children's room, and there was a small walk-in closet or some kind of space. I'm not sure anymore. It looked like someone was there not too long ago. When they inspected the house from the outside, they found children's handprints on the basement windows. Then they had to leave quickly because someone was coming in a car. It could have been staged, but I have been searching for the video for years and I couldn't find it. It disappeared not too long after I watched it. Why would they remove a staged video? There were even more creepy details that I don't remember anymore. People in the comments were saying stuff like someone abuses children here or whatnot. It's eerie that that kind of video just disappeared. Story 25. My brother-in-law is an avid ghost hunter, and he brought me along to this place in Maryland. To enter, we had to crawl into this tunnel which looked like a hole in the rock. When we shimmied through the hole, opened up into this stone ruin, it was like a cellar with 2 rooms. Cave bugs with long whip-like protrusions crawled all over the walls. Everything was moist and damp. When we crossed from one room into the second, I turned around and there was an axe leaning against the wall next to the doorway. There was a bedroll and a half-eaten hunk of cooked meat just laying on the stone, like someone was interrupted mid-meal and left. Now I have hearing damage and have had trouble hearing since I was a baby. When we left, my brother-in-law grabbed the axe very casually and we just left. As we were walking, pitch black at night, I heard very clearly the snap of twigs behind me. I couldn't see anything, but I told my brother-in-law I thought we were being followed. Without turning around, he said, "Yep, for a while." Nothing ever happened. We got back to our cars and left, but I noped out of ever exploring again. That was in 2009. I've never gone again since. Story 26. I used to be heavy into urban exploration, primarily in Alaska and Arizona during my peak. In Arizona, there is a town called Two Guns that has been bought, sold, developed, and abandoned more than 20 times in the past 50 years, which has led to some local folklore about it being haunted. Now, there's the developed section of Two Guns that is comprised of old derelict buildings, abandoned swimming pools, half-constructed edifices that have fallen into ruin, and the expected. Nothing spooky here. Then there is another area on the outskirts, which has what, I found out later, are known locally as the Apache Death Caves. They are twisting, vermicular caverns that yawn up from the earth, full of jagged edges like a sharp-toothed maw of the earth's darker interiors. The scariest aspect is how suddenly they appear in the ground if one was covered by even a thin layer of brush or a light dusting of snow that collected. It's easy to see how one would fall to their death without any forewarning. I approached one on my belly and took a few pictures with flash, exposing the interior, which to the naked eye just looks like a jet black pit that swallows up all light. The appearance and risk of falling into them was not what haunted me about them though. Rather, it was the sound emitted from them even in the absence of surrounding input. A hollow, deep-bellied, albeit faint roar, or more like a moan, could be heard coming from their innards. It was as if the wind was sucked into its corridors, translated into some non-Euclidean nameless horror of a language, and projected back out as the sound of 1,000 tremulous souls caught in an eternal horror of its bowels. The flash revealed a set of bones, pristine save a light dusting of dirt, which led me to believe even insects avoided flying into their open maws. I later read that the Apache Indians would use these caverns as traps for horsemen during raids and attacks during the expanse across the west by colonist settlers. I cannot begin to imagine dying in such a way, surrounded by the pitch black. The sounds of screams and groans echoing into an eternity of maddening terror as the air and light of the world is violently wrenched away and replaced with agony and isolation. One may as well have just been buried alive in an Iron Maiden. My exploration partner and I left at nightfall and never returned. Oh, I can't tell if it's truly spooky or if it's just the way this guy writes. He's got a way with words, half of which I'm sure I didn't say correctly, but regardless, spooky stuff. Story 27. This is a long one, so there is a too long didn't read at the end. In my old apartment, there was an old, burnt-out house with a ghost story attached to it, which I will share at the end. I heard it all the time growing up and never believed it. After all, I was a Trekkie, so everything had to have a logical, scientific explanation. I joined a band as a young adult with a guy that claimed to be a medium. We had a number of discussions, but never changed each other's minds. One day, we wanted to take pictures. We wanted an abandoned building, so I suggested the old house from my old neighborhood. I never told anyone in the band the ghost story, and my hometown was an hour from where we rehearsed. So we loaded up and went down to the old burnt house. We got some great stuff on the first floor, then went upstairs. We're setting up in one room when the photographer asks, "Hey, D, you good?" D was the medium. D was really quiet, staring into space, and he had his crucifix out. He was rubbing that thing. D looks over and goes, "Guys, we need to leave." We ask him why, and he says in the coldest voice I've ever heard, "I'm communicating with a spirit right now, and she says we have to leave." I laughed and said, "Yeah, right. You're scared of some ghost girl? D looks me dead in the eye and says, "It is a little girl, and she's not the one we need to worry about. It's the man in the back. He's coming." Dude, every hair on my body stood at attention. I don't remember leaving the room or going downstairs. The next thing I knew was I'm sitting on the grass 50 yards from the house, puffing on a cigarette like my life depended on it. You see, Reddit, the ghost story is as follows. Back in the late 30s, the man that lived in that house was kidnapping and SAing young girls. He picked one particular little girl who fought back when he tried to force himself on her in the house. She fought him so hard that he stabbed her before going to his room to pass out. She wasn't dead yet though, and kicked over the oil lamp in the room. Both were killed in the fire. But the rash of attacks on young girls in town stopped. The limited forensics of the time period confirmed that the fire was in her room and she had stab wounds. Now, her ghost and his inhabit the shell of the house. He is a malevolent spirit. She is a benevolent one who has consigned herself to containing his presence. But when trespassers enter the room where he essayed his victims, he will be drawn to them. She will try to ward trespassers away, going so far as to manifest herself when people are especially stubborn. I told the guys the story and ended up sitting down for lessons on the spiritual realm with D. Needless to say, I believe in ghosts now. Too long didn't read. I never believed the ghost story about a haunted house. My medium friend met the ghost without knowing the story. Now I'm a believer. Story 28. Stumbled upon an arson in progress and didn't realize it until the place was burned down the next day. My friends and I used to explore a lot of abandoned places many years back, still do from time to time, and our favorite places to visit was Woodville State Hospital in Pittsburgh. For a couple years, we would make frequent trips up there and sneak in and explore. It was so massive. There was always something different to check out. Well, one evening we go up there and we hear noises, like someone breaking things. We figure it's a couple other kids just being a-holes and vandalizing things. But when we tried to find out who was responsible, we couldn't find anyone around. Apparently, they noticed us and decided to sneak away before we got too close to the main building. We didn't think too much of it until we got inside the main building, the one with the giant bell tower and chapel and such. The entire main room had been filled with debris, and this was a huge room. Broken pianos and tables and chairs and pallets, etc. had all been dragged into this giant main room and scattered all around into a giant pile. This freaked us out quite a bit, as we recognized most of the items in the pile, and it would have taken a lot of effort, most definitely more than one person, to gather all of these items up from around the grounds and place them all in here. We didn't understand why people would do this, and it freaked us the F out, so we ran out of there. The next day, shortly after sundown, I get a call from my best friend, all in a panic, yelling for me to turn on the news. So I tune in to see live coverage of Woodville burning to the ground. All of the big buildings had been set ablaze. The debris we saw getting piled up was used as fuel to commit arson. Apparently, we interrupted them that day, so they fled, and then did it the next night. Story 29. Was exploring an abandoned asylum in Scotland. And it wasn't so bad because all the roofs and floors had collapsed and it was all pretty open and you could literally run in any direction to get out. Except on the way out, I saw this little square opening in the foundations that was a little bit narrower than my shoulders and about 1.5 feet long. So I stuck my head in with a head torch on and started looking around inside. Not much to see, but a roughly 10-foot corridor with a turn at the end and a couple of inches of water. I said something to one of my buddies standing at my feet and noticed that there was a pretty cool echo when I spoke. So I started making all the usual random sounds you make when playing with the echoey environment until I heard a very distinctive slosh of water, exactly like someone going from standing stock still in the shallow water to taking a step in my direction from just around the corner of the corridor. I've never launched myself backwards from the prone position faster in my life. Story 30. We were exploring the grounds of an old church and monastery in a very bad part of town. We went through the church, explored as much as possible, and avoided going down into the basement because we started to get a bad feeling, then headed to the monastery. The bad feeling was still hanging over us as we walked into the monastery, which only had one way to get in and out. There was a hallway to our right, which led to rooms and a staircase to upstairs, and then there was a room directly in front of us. We glanced down the hallway and there was nothing blocking our path. We went into the room right in front of us, explored, but there was nothing of interest. Came out of the room and turned down the hallway. Right in the middle of the hall was a giant pile of fresh human crap. We're talking new poop that was still steaming in the cold air. Needless to say, we booked it. It wasn't the crap that was scary, it was the fact that the person it came from was literally still in the monastery with us. So always trust your bad feelings and never explore abandoned properties alone, because you never know who else is in there. Story 31. I grew up in a very small town, nestled in a large, sprawling pine forest. When I was in high school, a few friends and I were hanging out at our friend's house right on the edge of woods. We'd been hanging out and watching movies all night, and it was getting late. But being teenagers, none of us were tired, so the friend whose house it was told us about an abandoned house in the woods that was supposedly haunted. I was bored and a tad cocky, so I said we should all go check it out. It took some convincing, but finally all three of my friends were on board, and we set off into the woods in the middle of the night with nothing but our cell phones for light and some Nerf guns I had in my trunk, because I thought it'd be fun to run around an abandoned house shooting each other. After some time wandering through the woods, we find the place, sitting alone in the top of the little hill. The house itself wasn't too old or run down. The 2008 financial crisis hit our town especially hard, so I reasoned that it was probably a house built within the last 20 years or so that was just foreclosed and abandoned when the housing market crashed. Because the house was situated on a hill, we entered through the basement. Nothing unexpected down there, just some broken bottles and graffiti. We moved slowly up the creaking stairs to the main floor. Again, nothing out of the ordinary there, just some broken windows, empty beer bottles. The dishwasher was ripped halfway out and chained to a drawer. Definitely got the sense it was just a place used for partying. We're about to leave when I see that there's an attic. We come this far, so naturally I have to check it out. However, right at this point, the hair starts to stand up on the back of our necks, and this feeling that something is off sets in. One other friend and I push past the feeling and head up the stairs to the attic. When we get up the stairs, we see it's actually a whole third floor with 3 rooms, each of which is closed. In an act of bravado, I kick open the first door and find a completely empty room with nothing but an old-looking wooden chair, directly in the center of the room facing a big bay window that looks out at another house off in the distance. Spooky feeling intensifies, but I'm not going to stop until I've seen every inch of the house. My friend and I move to the next room. Nothing out of the ordinary there but some mangled bed frames. On to the last room. There's a brownish red stain on the door, but it's dark, and logically it's probably just a paint splatter from some other teenagers trying to scare us. So we shrug it off and enter the room. With both disappointment and relief, we see there's nothing out of the ordinary there. So my friend and I turn to leave, but on our way back to the stairs, we see a 4th room we hadn't seen before. A small half bathroom with the door open. In the dim light from my cell phone flashlight, I can see that there's something weird about the back wall to the bathroom. I pick up a board that's laying on the ground and push on the wall. It swings open to reveal a small but fully stocked little girl's room. Clothes hanging in the closet, pink kid bed with a flowery pink bedspread on it that looks like it was just slept in. Tiny flowery lamp on an end table in the corner. At this point, every fiber in my being is screaming at me to get out immediately because I reasoned that I either stumbled on a predator den or the room of a dead little girl that the parents couldn't stand to enter after she passed. I wasn't equipped to deal with the ghost of a dead kid or a predator kidnapper, so I promptly got the F out of there. Weeks later, I tried to return to the house in the daylight with my sister, but I got lost in the woods and couldn't find it. I still think about it, almost 10 years later. Story 32. There was this strip of road near the place where I lived. Old bunkers were spaced out from each other along it. I was riding my bike with my headphones in and was just exploring the road because I'd never gone down it before. It was the afternoon, and I wasn't really spooked by anything going down it. Hadn't had any cars pass either. There was this one bunker that had its door open and it was covered with graffiti all over. I stopped right across from it and I got curious when I took a break to drink some water. I placed my kickstand down, got off my bike and began to approach it. I was sort of tensing up. Despite it being the afternoon, there was barely any sunlight going through the doorway. I got closer and all of a sudden I hear, "Go back," in a very whispery tone, and well, I effing ran. No, I sprinted back to my bike. I took off and lifted the kickstand while I was going and pedaled faster than ever before. It wasn't until a few days later I was sitting on the bus going home with my headphones in that I heard the same "go back" in my ear. Turns out I really didn't hear anything of the sort come from the bunker. It was just effing Snowblind by Black Sabbath playing at the worst possible moment. I was not amused with myself. Story 33. Nothing abandoned, but I went to a nearby beach at like 2 a.m. I was going there just to have a fire and chill for a while. I don't know why. The street that leads to the beach is rather long and is supposed to be haunted. I didn't care that much and still went. When I reached the beach, there's a chain on the entrance so cars can't get in. I had a bike, so it wasn't a huge problem. When you reach the entrance to the beach, there was a small bathroom building to your right. So when I went over the chain, which made a lot of noise because I'm stupid, I started walking my bike towards the beach when I heard something like rummaging around near the bathroom. I just assumed it was an animal or something, but 2 seconds later I heard loud footsteps over to the bathrooms. I freaked the heck out, hopped over the chain, and biked for my life. The footsteps I heard weren't like someone running. It was more like someone angrily dancing. I biked till I got away from the road. I started biking back home when I turned around for a split second and saw at the entrance to the long road under the street lamp a black figure. It looked kind of like a short, slender man, but when I turned back around, it was gone. So I don't think I'm going back to that road. I've always assumed that the thing in the bathroom was some homeless dude, but the thing under the street lamp, that creeped the heck out of me. Story 34. I was exploring an old abandoned TB hospital that was later a hospital for mentally ill youth with some friends. It was located kind of on a hill in a wooded area, removed from the nearby main roads, and we had to slip under a fence to access the property. Everything went pretty well most of our exploration. There were some eerie remnants of its former life, like empty rooms with lone rocking horses, an old stage and theater, and those weird metal bed things used for embalming or perhaps just washing patients down. On the 3rd or 4th floor, there was a room labeled Morgue in spray paint. One of my buddies and I decided to check it out, and upon entry, it looked to be some sort of power control room with big fuses arrayed across a bunch of big control boards. We walked in for a closer look with our flashlights, when suddenly the big steel door slammed shut behind us. The dang thing no longer had a knob or handle on our side, so there was no way for us to get out. We started pounding somewhat anxiously on the door to get our other friends' attention, when I started hearing movement and fuses popping out of their sockets and clattering to the ground. Not long after, our friends heard and were able to get the door open from the other side. That was kind of our cue to wrap things up, since that situation could have been pretty ugly if we didn't have other people in the place to hear us. As for the door, noises, and fuses, in hindsight I attribute them to natural phenomenon. Perhaps the door hinges were warped and banging on the door may have made some of the fuses pop out of the boards. Still pretty dang creepy in the moment though. Story 35. Most of the responses in this thread are either scary or disgusting. I'd like to offer a story that's simply sad. Went into a boarded up, condemned building on the south side of Chicago. 3 stories, kind of like a townhouse architecture but freestanding. It had been abandoned for a long time. There was a very, very tiny lawn, super overgrown, and the whole lot was surrounded by a chain link fence covered in warnings to stay out. It was surprisingly not a trap house. It smelled like urine and had that dusty, cobwebby, uncleaned feel that empty houses do. And there was graffiti all over the walls, but no needles or anything. Honestly, it was a pretty fun place for exploring. No idea why it was condemned. The 3rd room I poked into was clearly occupied. The occupant wasn't there, but on the ground there was a lumpy, dirty futon mattress with some sheets, some various personal items strewn around, clothes, etc. The 2 things that hit me were this. There were 2 cups beside the bed. One was a disposable paper fast food cup, like you'd get at KFC or whatever for the soda fountain. And the other was the red, hard, semi-opaque plastic kind from old pizza places. One was half full of water, and the other had a toothbrush in it. The idea of someone having separate cups for these was humanizing and heartbreaking to me. There was a teddy bear in the bed. It was a really cheap, generic blue knockoff Care Bear, super old and well-worn. Again, weirdly humanizing. Whoever resided here had a whole history with that bear. It was clearly a well-loved object, albeit absolutely filthy, but so was the rest of the nest on the futon. I did not meet the occupant, but I left after going into that room. It was no longer an exploration, but an intrusion. The person who lived there was suddenly a real person, not just some rando, but someone who cared about brushing their teeth and rinsing, and slept with a stuffed animal and who had fallen on hard times. It was sobering and really sad. Story 36. So a few years back, I visited some college friends of mine for Halloween. We trick-or-treated, went to a party, and were wrapping up our night when my buddy got an idea about checking out an abandoned mansion a few miles away. The rumor was these rich people bred large wild cats under the house, and all of a sudden disappeared a couple of years before. Nobody knew what happened, but cars, house, lights were left on, etc. We said, F it, let's go. We climbed the gate and went into a back door that was half missing by then. We immediately smelled the stench of the place, like rotting compost smell. We started upstairs and found everything intact, basically. Silverware still left on the table, fancy electronics were still there, and even the bedrooms were all made nice and neat. My buddy decided to take a couple fancy bottles of wine and liquor as proof we went in there. Literally, this house was fancy, tidy, and seemed left alone. We followed the smell. It was nasty, smelled like sewage at this point. We get downstairs and we knew something was wrong. Cages everywhere. I'm talking at least a dozen cages 8 feet long, 5 feet wide, and about 5 feet tall, just lined this entire basement area. We found the smell. Decomposing raccoon carcasses, deer, and possums all over the dang place. We found a few big cat skeletons still in the cages too. Felt bad for these big cats, rumored to be tigers, jaguars, and leopards, were left for dead in these cages. We found the smell more around this time. My buddy stepped in a semi-fresh pile of crap. A big pile of crap Dr. Malcolm would have said, that's a big pile of crap. Around this time, we felt a little breeze and some weird noise. I swear we started hearing growling and movement around this basement. You could hear something and see the dust movement in our flashlights from our phones. We freaked out after we heard another growl and ran upstairs. We get upstairs and head towards the back door we came in. And out of the corner of my eye, I see this blinking red light above the door in the corner. Didn't give a crap, kept running out the door and up the stairs. Boom! Flashlight right in our face and the distinct sound of a shotgun being racked back. This man was the caretaker, as he called himself, and he looked and sounded very much like an upset, grouchy, old fisherman type guy. I don't call the cops when I handle business, was the one line I will never forget. Long story short, he held us at gunpoint and called the owners of the house. We had a choice: get our butts kicked by this caretaker and give him something he wanted, or pay him $10,000 and the owners would forget this. We agreed to pay since one of my buddies was a cop, one was an attorney, and I was a commissioned officer in the military. This trespassing would ruin us basically. We had 10 days to pay up, so we did. Left 10 grand in cash in the mailbox outside the gate in the morning of the 10th day, where the caretaker took it and walked away. We never heard from anyone, since apparently the caretaker still can be seen rarely walking around the property holding a flashlight. The growl we heard? One panther is rumored to have gotten out and is still seen from time to time on the roads by the locals. One assumption is the owners were getting caught for illegal animal breeding and left the country since they were Israeli nationals. The caretaker probably gets paid money to watch the property, which explains the active cameras in the house. The house had fresh crap and decomposing carcasses. Maybe the panther still uses the place as a home. Who knows? F that house. Story 37. Not necessarily an abandoned building, but about 10 years ago, me and a buddy were driving back from the airport, and before I dropped him home, we thought it would be a good idea to smoke a little end-of-holiday night cap joint at our usual spot. The only difference was it was 3 a.m. instead of the usual 7 p.m. or whatever. We're at our spot near a pub, but a little out of the way. Dead silence around us. We start to hear a strange sound, like a creaking sound with heavy breathing. We turn around, and coming towards us are two very strange-looking men, looking rough, odd clothes, disheveled appearances, wheeling what seems to be a very heavy Sulu bin, big UK wheelie bin. As soon as they see us, they stop dead in their tracks and start rolling a cigarette. We're only about 10 meters apart now, and we've sort of just paralyzed ourselves watching them, because any conversation between us would be audible to them. One guy then says, "Hey, do you guys have a lighter?" We have a joint in our hands. Of course we have a lighter. "Nah, sorry, we don't." And we both just nope the F out of there at the same time, walking straight to our car and getting the F out of there. Story 38. While exploring my grandpa's ranch, he had stopped raising dairy cattle and milking them, had roughly 100 dairy cows about 16 years ago. He also used to breed and raise good ranch horses, had 45 horses, and he had about 400 beef cattle, now down to 100. Since then, he has one horse left, 24-year-old black gelding, who he used to rodeo on. His best friend in horse form, which is why he hasn't sold him ever. The reason why he stopped with the dairy cows and horse business was because the economy dropped so drastically. He had to pick and choose what he could afford to keep doing. Also, he had 2 heart attacks related to his stress levels of running a ranch with just himself and my aunt helping. He still grows and sells hay. I was pretty young, but I remember seeing all his horses out in huge meadows with foals, baby horses, that would run up to you and see you and all his cattle spread out across the hundreds of acres. I remember the dairy cows and seeing one of them have a calf. I was about 4 years old. Anyway, I was exploring the old dairy section of the ranch. It is very eerie, especially at dawn and dusk. I was out there at dusk and the old light outside the milking barn is still on. It never turns off. I found a calendar on the wall inside the barn, and it was on May 1996. Never moved since then. There was still grain on the floor, still water in the troughs. I stumbled upon a couple dead cats inside the barn and a dead cow right outside the barn, near where he let the dairy cows out into a meadow every day. Inside the milk barn, there was an upstairs. I don't go up there because you will fall through the floorboards. But I heard footsteps above me, and it scared the heck out of me. My great-great-grandpa bought this ranch, and he died on the ranch along with great-grandpa, and I'm sure my grandpa will too. He is 78 currently. I believe they are still there as spirits, doing their routine on the ranch. My family started the ranch probably around 120 to 130 years ago. Side note, there are so many old log buildings. I'm not sure what one of the buildings was used for, but it's pretty big. Not collapsed yet, but not used anymore. Then he has an old tack shed. Saddles that are 70 years old tied with ropes to the ceiling to keep them off the ground. Bridles, bits, halters, and everything you can think of on the ground. The shed is leaning real bad. I'm surprised it hasn't collapsed yet. I'm not sure why all that expensive tack was left to rot in there, especially since a lot of them used to be extremely fancy saddles, covered in silver. There is another old log barn with more tack that is still used. It is in good condition. There's a lot of old creepy things there, but I just wanted to give you an idea of the place. Story 39. We were taking photos exploring in a more or less abandoned industrial building complex shortly before it was scheduled for demolition. Old brick buildings, iron columns, halls with nice window frames but missing panes, the works. One of the huge halls had a sort of corridor running parallel to the floor where all the engineers had been. There were openings into the workshop every 15 feet or so, but the corridor itself had no windows, so it was really dark. We were looking for a way to the stairwell to see the second floor. Our steps alternated between echoing and muted shuffling, and something was skittering along the catwalks above us, and our torches made the darkness worse. It was way too dark to move without them, so we kept them low. We reached the end of the hallway, fully expecting to find a door or stairs. All we found was a solid wall. Its bricks looked newer than the rest of the building, albeit still a bit scuffed. There was one graffiti on this wall, stretching over its entire width. It was a single word: run. We did not say a word, we didn't even exchange glances, we simply ran. Story 40. I've never really been the "I'm bored, let's go into that shack over there and see if we find a dead body" type, but when I was little, my cousin was definitely like that. I remember living in the country, and down the road I lived on, there was this really old and gross looking building that was like an old cabin, I think, in the middle of an unused field. Me and my friend would sometimes dare each other to run up and touch it, but never actually went up to the door or ever went inside. I have a deathly fear of bugs crawling in my ears and hate going anywhere where bugs would be near my head. My cousin was sent to our house during a summer and was extremely bored. We had to walk 1.5 miles to a McDonald's/gas station to get Wi-Fi and had no TV or internet at home. My cousin loved creepypastas and horror stories and would read them to me, and this conversation sparked the mention of the cabin, and her eyes literally lit up as soon as I said it, and I knew I was screwed. Sorry, none of that's super relevant, but it tells you what kind of stuff led up to it. So basically, we were in front of this cabin, and I kept telling her how horrible an idea it was, and then she literally ran straight up to the door of it. I didn't want to go in, but at the same time, I kinda like my cousin, and I didn't want her to get hurt, trapped, or die or something. Of course, I myself was a chubby 12-year-old girl, so not like I was much better than her, who was 13. So I ran up with her. The door was nailed shut, but the wood on the outside was super rotten and falling apart, so she was able to kick it open pretty easily. She walked straight inside, and I followed behind her with my hands pressed over my ears, Like I said, fear of bugs. There was a really big open room, and then a wall on the side with another doorway in the middle of the wall. And in the first room, there were plants growing everywhere, mold, nails poking out of everywhere, and there wasn't any furniture except for like one table in the corner. And there were spiders everywhere, which made me beg my cousin to just go home, but she wanted to see what was behind the corner. There was also an absolutely disgusting smell, and I wanted to vomit, but I assumed it was all the mold. My cousin and I got up to the doorway that led to the second room, and we both freaked the heck out. There were giant skeletons everywhere. Like this whole other room was filled, like almost to the ceiling, with skeletons. We didn't know what they were at the time, but apparently they were horse skeletons. Neither of us had horses, so we had no real way of knowing, I guess. But we knew they were animal skeletons, and some still had like flies on them. I'm not a screamer, but I definitely jumped back like 3 feet and bolted out as fast as possible. My cousin wasn't far behind me, and once we were outside, we didn't stop running until we were halfway home. We stopped, and my cousin actually threw up in the middle of the road from how scared she was, plus running so fast. I still don't know why the heck a cabin was filled with a bunch of horse skeletons, and when I told my mom and aunt, they also had no answers. But we did get yelled at for being dumb. I know horse skeletons are huge, but this room was also pretty big, and they seriously almost filled it to the ceiling. They were all in pieces. There were leg bones, skulls, a whole rib cage. I still wonder why some still had flies on them. Like, were some added more recently or something? But like now I have nightmares about some horse serial killer or something. Does anyone know what the heck we even saw? Like, I'm genuinely still confused. Like, yeah, I took an hour-long shower and all we did for the rest of summer was clean the house and make weird face mask things. I have since, like, moved, so I don't know if that shack is still there. Story 41. I was exploring a disused hospital, which basically stopped getting used in the 80s. There were talks to sell or refurbish the land, but it all fell through. Just a small, rural hospital. Most of the rooms were bare, with only rubbish in them, and it was quite beautiful. It was late summer, and it was warm, motes of dust dancing in beams of sunlight, plants growing right up against the windows, a sense of stillness in the air. I'm following the faded signs on the walls. Admin, waiting rooms, GP offices. Find that the surgery is locked, but there's a sign for the chapel. I thought it could be nice to sit in a disused chapel for a bit. The chapel is stacked, floor to ceiling, with gurneys. The whole room dull steel and tangled wire. There's no reason to the way they are stacked, a nightmarish tangle of broken bed trolleys. The altar was hidden through this mass of metal, but as soon as I look through, the anguished eye of Christ sees me between metal bars. I was so unsettled as I entered. The room had a very strange energy, but seeing Christ hidden by tangled, twisted metal ramped this anxiety up, and I found myself fleeing from the chapel. The hospital was demolished in 2014. Story 42. 2. Location scouting for a shoot, looking for an old abandoned farmhouse. I lucked out with some people in the first incident. We were told of an old farmhouse amongst a grove of trees, so went to look. After a bit of poking around, I stepped into the linoleum in the kitchen and my foot went straight through, like stepping on a sheet of paper. Half my body went through, but somehow I caught myself with my arms and my one foot still on the firm floor. I called for help and crawled and pulled myself out. Turns out there was a cistern under the kitchen. All those years of having floorboards covered with linoleum and moist air below had caused the entire wood slats below to rot into basically nothing. I'm somewhat afraid of the dark and closed spaces, and it still gives me a horrifying feeling imagining if I had been alone and had gone right into that cistern. Imagining the state of the water. The bugs, dead animals, putrid water. I have no idea how deep it was. I sprained my ankle badly, but considered myself lucky. The second was another location for a scout for a shoot, but not in abandoned houses. I was invited to a farmhouse on someone's property, their old house, which was mostly empty. I found the place and walked in alone. It had the feel of a 50s 4-level split, but in a 1980s renovated way. Everything was fine until I got to the top floor. I was completely overtaken with terror for no logical reason. I'm a fairly smart and rational person. I can't explain this, but I felt I was in the presence of something evil, something that would completely crush me if it could. This sense of doom and dread hit me so hard I ran down the stairs with my camera and out the door and hopped in my car and drove away fast. I parked at the top of the hill where I could still see the farmhouse. I looked at it and I wanted to laugh at myself, to dismiss it as my mind was playing tricks on me. but I couldn't. It felt far too real. I got in my car and drove to the nearest town. Went into a gas station trying to forget the feeling, wondering if everyone could see it on my face somehow. I grabbed some bad food and went back to my car. I climbed in, sat down, and began to weep. I can't explain this. It was likely my mind or subconscious messing with me, but part of me is still convinced I encountered something awful that day. Story 43. Odds are you're either going to not believe me or try to rationalize this, but it's 100% true and I haven't been able to figure out what it was that my friend and I heard. Anyway, there's this abandoned asylum about 10-minute drive from my mom's house. Big campus, foreboding brick buildings, all that good stuff. So, winter of 2017, my friend and I decided to head over there and explore one of the buildings. We arrived, and the only way to get in was through a broken window that led to the basement. We climbed through and started walking around. It was freezing and quiet, but it wasn't dark since it was broad daylight. It was the basement, but it had a lot of windows looking outside, so there was light coming in. We got a bit bored of the basement, so we decided to head upstairs. We reached the 4th or 5th landing, so my friend went to open the door. As soon as he did, we both heard this sound that sounded like a mix between a baby, full-grown man, woman, dog, mountain lion, and lawnmower screaming, laughing, and crying all at the same time. We noped out of there. Story 44. There's this place in the northern Adirondacks called Tajas. It's a twice-abandoned ghost town that my mother was fascinated with. We went there seemingly every other month. The houses would degrade more and more, but one would always stay the same: the Roosevelt Cabin. It was maintained because of how important it is to history, and although it was supposed to be, it was never locked. We'd gone in there dozens of times, but the last time was when I decided to stop going to Tajas for good. I don't know why, but for those who don't believe in ghosts, this might not sound real, but it felt so strange when I entered. Like the feeling you get when you're silent in a room full of people yelling and fighting. Then suddenly a chill went down my spine and I had a vision, things that aren't rare for me, of myself hanging from a rope on the 2nd story with the ground broken beneath me. Typical horror movie idiot here, I decided to go up on the 2nd story anyway. I'm not sure what room it was, maybe a bedroom, but the floor felt unstable there. It would creak and shift and moan like it would give out at any second. Then I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. It was a rope, and I couldn't stop myself from running away in terror. My family kept asking me why I never wanted to go back, because they said it was our town, but it isn't, and never should have been. That town belongs to something else, something that didn't want us there. If you ever want to go there, it's near Newcomb in New York. Look it up and be careful. I'm never going back, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't. Despite my belief that it's haunted, the town is beautiful. Just watch out for rattlesnakes on those trails, and unless you have the stomach for hauntings, do not go in the Roosevelt Cabin. Yeah, it's a bit late to sell me on the town. Even if it's not haunted, the silver lining was it's beautiful, but there's rattlesnakes? No thanks, I'm a baby. Story 45. I don't like to explore abandoned buildings, but one time, 4 years ago, my girlfriend at the time and I went to an abandoned bottling factory in Milwaukee. And mind you, it was a pretty well-known spot, so nothing seemed unusual about the other couple that was also around exploring. We made our rounds through the various rooms and crossed paths a few times, but they didn't seem like the talkative type and wanted to be left alone. Fine by us, we just kept doing on what we were doing. We get to this ladder that goes up to the roof, and it's towards dusk time, so we thought we'd go watch the sunset from up there. We walk around a bit and have a nice chat, watching the colors of the sky change, and make our way back down. As we come down, we could see the other couple leaving, and started to make our way out as well. All is normal so far until we walk past a clock tower, part of the building with huge flames billowing out of the empty windows on the 2nd floor, about the same levels where we were on the roof. We called 911 and let them know we saw flames and there was only one other couple there with us, and left in our car. To this day, I'll never know if this was an attempted arson homicide or if they thought we left already and were just interested in the arson part. Story 46. The location was an abandoned municipal jail set up in the foothills of the mountains in a valley town in Utah. A fairly quiet area with a fair bit of history, and thus a lot of locations to explore. We were all college kids, ranging from freshmen to juniors, one of the latter being the type to barge into our apartment at 10 at night to invite us young and impressionable youths to go and explore an abandoned prison. So of course my roommate and I say yes. When given the opportunity, what 18-year-old hopped up on reruns of X-Files wouldn't want to explore an abandoned jailhouse, especially one that was alleged to be haunted? We were stuffed 5 deep in this Mazda Protege within 5 minutes and en route. Upon arrival, we were greeted with a very ill-lit and overgrown fence, which we breached via a decent-sized hole. The frontage of the place was odd, lots of grass and 60s modern design but clearly untouched for decades, save graffiti and broken bottles, dumped tires, and the like. The layout was similarly strange, practically built into the side of the foothills, 2 stories, but only the upper was immediately visible. The lower story half buried into the hillside and half exposed by design, with an exercise yard fenced in at the bottom. We near the front entrance and find that it's chained tight, so we proceed around to the side and down a narrow flight of exterior stairs to an entrance without a door. The older of us go first, the rest of us piling up outside the doorway to wait for a signal. After about a minute, we hear the sound of gravel crunching loudly, followed by the sound of our brave leader sprinting full blast. He runs out of the building and up the stairs, leaving the rest of us to follow suit or figure out whatever spooked him the hard way. We, of course, sprint after him. After we reach the fence, he looks at us and said he was about to walk through a doorway when a stick got thrown through at him. He never saw what threw it, but it clearly wasn't something that could just happen without somebody doing the throwing. So he turned and ran without a second thought. We weighed our options. We halfway wanted to see what it was that threw the stick. However, we didn't want to get killed by whatever ghoul, hobo, or otherwise had done the throwing. So, of course, we made a slow approach back towards the building, but with hopes of finding a different way in. Not halfway to the building, we hear this freakish, unhuman-sounding moan. Literally, like whatever was making it was right beside us, but we knew it came from inside the jail. Without a word, we all stood, turned, and ran as fast as humanly possible through the hole in the fence back to the Mazda. Whatever or whoever made that sound was definitely not something we had any desire to see up close. Story 47. One time I was at an abandoned middle school that I've skated in with no problems, since the doors were unlocked and the lights still worked, but it was in the middle of bum F nowhere. So me and a couple of friends had gotten our hands on some DMT and we wanted to try it, but didn't really have anywhere else to go, so we headed to school. One of the guys was going first, baby stepping it, and burning the crap out of it since we didn't have proper tools and or technique, so we'd get a feel for it. So it comes to be my turn to try it. As I'm hitting the DMT, unsuccessfully, thank God, we start hearing this tapping noise that starts out really quiet but is steadily getting louder. It's not the drugs, because the third friend, who hadn't tried it yet, was hearing it too. We're absolutely terrified at this point, as you can imagine. Once it starts vibrating the floor, we had enough of trying to figure out what that noise could have been, and we book it to my car and got the F out of there. Had my hit been successful, I would not have been able to get us out of there, and it would have fallen to me regardless, since my car's a stick shift and none of my friends know how to drive stick. Seriously, the most scariest crap I've ever been a part of. It's a fun memory now, but gosh dang it, that was terrifying. Story 48. In my town, middle-class suburbs, there was an abandoned house near a park, so it was a popular spot for teens to smoke pot and do teen stuff. So one day a friend and I are walking around the house looking for a loose window to pry open. All of a sudden, through the windows, I see piles of bagged drugs, a bong, scale, and a half-eaten pizza. There were 2 card tables full of bags. I think I was 16 at the time, so part of me was like, oh, sick. And then a split second later, I'm like, oh, effing crap, we're gonna get shot for seeing this. So we run the heck out of there, and I call a friend who would know more about what to do in a situation than I did. He had the same reaction as me, excited by the Escobar level action in our otherwise lazy summer, but also terrified. We wanted to see what it was all about, so we ended up calling the police. Picture a 16-year-old stoner girl talking to the officer like, yeah, we found like a lot of drugs near the park. About an hour passes and no cops show up. Randomly, the town fire chief rolls up to see what we were doing in an empty parking lot. So I show him the pictures and he goes crazy. He's dying to know too. So we wait longer and nothing. Finally, he drives to the park office to get some info. 5 minutes later, he returns with a smile. Turns out the house was being used as a drug den for a movie. Story 49. Not strictly an abandoned building story, but hope you will enjoy it all the same. In 1964, the Air Force assigned my dad, a captain with SAC, to service Barksdale AFB in Bossier City, LA. After settling in during the summertime, I fell in with a group of kids around my age, 11, that would be sharing 5th grade with me when school started that year. Some of them were Air Force brats, and the rest had lived near the base all their lives, so we were all comfortable with airfields, military activity, etc. One day we were hanging out near a remote fence when we spied a weird opening. It wasn't a gate exactly, as it had no movable parts, but had partitions extending out on both sides of the fence, so you couldn't run straight through the fence but could easily enter if you followed the corridors. My new friends dared me to sneak onto the base and see what was the nearest hangar. Eager to prove myself to them, I agreed. After making my way through the fence, I raced across the tarmac to the nearest open hangar. Peering inside, I saw the craziest looking jet with enormous wings that almost touched both sides of the hangar. The wings were held up with little wheels, not nearly the size of the usual landing gear. Everything about this jet was different to me, as I was well versed with most of the aircraft the USAF flew. Between my dad's career, air shows, model building, and the like, I thought I knew about all the current aircraft. But this jet I was looking at proved me wrong. Right away I knew I had effed up big time and was looking at something I was not supposed to be seeing in all likelihood. After I got back to my friends hiding in the field and described what I had seen, they agreed I was alright in their eyes, since I had been brave enough to take them up on their dare. At dinner that night, I casually asked my dad what kind of plane I had seen in the hangar. Gosh, when I think back on how naive I was to ask him what I had seen while trespassing on a military installation, my dad blew up, and I mean really blew up. Stood up and started shouting at me. Mom grabbed my brother and left the room and me to my fate. He was as angry as I'd ever seen him, and I melted in a blubbering mess in my chair. This caused him to stop, and Mom and brother made their way back to the table. Never addressing my questions about the plane in the hangar, he explained it to all of the family that if news about what I had done got out, it could cost him his assignment. Knowing I could have adversely affected my dad's career really shocked me. He then explained his anger was because of how close I had come to dying. I had no idea what he meant. Dad said, "Have you ever seen the Air Force's guard dogs, German Shepherds?" And I said yes. He said that opening the fence was where the guards and the dogs transitioned security sweeps from inside the fence to the outside perimeter. Had the dogs seen me, the guards would have released them to secure the intruder until the guards could catch up to them. To reinforce what he was saying, he took me to a demonstration of the guard dogs, how they were trained, and how lethal they could be. He never apologized for how angry he got, as he felt the situation deserved it. He just made it a point to educate me about how close I had come to being attacked and seriously injured by the guard dogs, and how much trouble it would have cost everyone if I had been caught trespassing on the base. He never directly answered my questions about the jet itself, but later, as more became revealed about the US spy plane, U-2, he said that's what you saw in the hangar. Although it was 4 years after famous U-2 pilot Gary Powers was shot down, there still wasn't much known about them by the general public. Only much later, when he was retired from the Air Force, did my father relate that in addition to his regular duties involving air refueling fighters and bombers, including a tour of duty in the Vietnam, he had also performed air refueling for our U-2 spy planes, especially during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Story 50. Found a druggie casually rolling a bowl while wandering around catching rattlesnakes for venom. I was fully loaded with my graffiti gear headed into the site and gave the monster with a bag of live snakes a joint as a peace offering. He was actually quite pleasant, but I have plenty of experience with users and did not want a bag of effing snakes kicking around while I was doing a painting with my back to the world. So I only dropped a quick character of the Snake Man on my way out. This was a mill with gobs of walls and cool crap, so it was a place I frequently painted at. Next time I went back, during the day to avoid the guy, he comes skipping up to me 2 minutes down the trail. "Hey dude, did you do the painting of me catching snakes?" "Yeah." "Man, do your thing. I got your back around here. I'll give you a holler if kids or cops come." And I said, "And, crappy junkies too." And he looks me dead in the eyes and goes, "F yeah, man. There's some effed up heads that come here. They camp right here over the summer." I did my painting that day, but I never went back. I do not want to see who that guy considers effed up. Story 51. Me and my 2 friends went into a bunker when we were 12, World War I era bunker, and we took a string with us so we didn't get lost and could backtrack easily with the string. So we found a few beer bottles from 1916 and of course graffiti. We certainly weren't the first guys in there. We also saw where the machine guns were and where they slept. Then we heard a sound of someone walking on a stick or something and panicked really hard. The string snapped and we just ran but got lost, and we were in there for like 20 minutes trying to get out. Another time, we went into a local abandoned hotel and found the usual: mattresses, beaten up furniture, glass shards from mirrors, etc. But we also found a bong made from a Coca-Cola bottle, and we didn't know what it was at the time. A crack pipe and a few needles. We live in a village with 1,500 people, so these things were shocking to my 12-year-old mind. When we entered the pools area, the ceiling really bent down and a piece of ceiling almost fell onto my friend's head, missed by not more than 10 centimeters. So we got scared and ran out. I still have some souvenirs from that hotel. It's been demolished. I know some other stories are way more interesting, but I just wanted to share. Story 52. I used to explore abandoned industrial buildings in the area I grew up in, and I had a few friends who I met online who did similar stuff in other states. One of them came out to my area, so we met up to hang out, and decided to explore a place nearby that I'd had my eye on but hadn't been to yet. We park at this old abandoned farmhouse, start walking up the road toward it with our cameras, and this sedan with tinted windows rolls up next to us, and there are two guys inside. One says to us, "What do you guys want with this place?" We explain we like taking pictures of abandoned buildings. Guy says, "So, trespassing. That's smart. Look, we've been watching this place for 3 days. This is a drug house, and they make drugs in there. You need to get the F out of here. You probably just blew our cover." We turned around and left. The passenger in the car definitely had a holstered gun on his belt. They looked like cops, but weren't dressed like cops, so I guess they could have been undercover. I imagine if they hadn't stopped us from going over there, things would have gone pretty badly for us. Story 53. One day I was an effing moron and went into a building without adequate PPE, and then saw a huge buildup of mouse droppings and a mouse kinda staggering around. Got the F out of there and had a fun few days obsessively hoping I didn't get hantavirus or the plague, both of which are in my area, not to mention all the other environmental hazards. The number of effing idiots who routinely explore abandoned buildings without PPE, if any of my photography students ever pull that in their classes, they fail the assignment, which is the least terrible thing that could happen to them. I still think about the stupid jerks who looted this abandoned building I know. There's a ton of lead and cadmium and whatever else leaching from the basement. Used to be a print shop. I've never stepped inside because I know what's in there. And somewhere there are total cockwombles with antique tchotchkes they stole, and lungs full of substances they make Flint look like the Sierra Club. They won't know what hit them for at least 10 years. The worst hazards in urbex are not only not obvious, but they might not show adverse effects for decades. I don't want to sacrifice my 70s to cancer just because I wanted to take a cool photo in my 20s. That so many people willingly do that when they could just strap on a cheap respirator just boggles my mind. Story 54. In downtown Columbia, South Carolina, there used to be a condemned asylum. It burned down recently, but I was lucky enough to explore it a couple of years ago before the fire razed it. It hadn't been used since the 1980s and truly became creepy over time. The main building and its supporting wings were 5 floors and a created complex, with long, narrow, and sometimes dirt-floored basements linking all the buildings. The dilapidation and decay inside the building was creating gaping holes in the floor that would sometimes go several floors down into the dark. Doors fallen from hinges, graffiti, glass strewn over the floors, and half-full filing cabinets filled the place. With that image set, some friends and I were exploring the 4th floor of the main building, not far from the central bell tower. It was probably after 1 a.m. and all we had were our phone flashlights that barely showed more than 10 feet in front of you. We came into an open room, and in the slight light there was a glint in the middle of the room. We moved in closer to get a good look at what was there. It was an old patient's chair complete with leather wrist straps. Under it, a pentagram, painted onto the floor in red paint. 3 feet in front of it, the petrified carcass of a cat. This room was covered in graffiti referencing the devil, dying and screaming. It was a freaky effing find. Everyone in the group but me and another guy pretty much bailed at that point. I overcame the fear long enough to sit in the chair for a picture. Then we started making our way out. Not long after leaving the room, we heard some thumping noise from the floor above us. And being we were spooked already, we got the F out of there in a half run, just fast enough to not fall through the floor in the massive holes. I never went back to that room ever again. Despite going back to the asylum a few times after that room is the scariest thing I ever experienced. If anyone is interested enough, and I can find the pictures, I'll post it. Story 55. A friend of mine moved into an old Victorian house that had been abandoned for some time. There was still old furniture and stuff from the former owners. Upstairs there was a bedroom where the floor in the far end was rotting, so we moved the furniture out to get ready for a contractor. Behind the old dresser was a small door, maybe 3 feet feet tall, too wide. Friend's boyfriend and I pulled it open. He crawled in. He said it was dark, so I gave him my lighter. Then I heard, "Ah!" He screamed like a 7-year-old girl and tore out of the darkness past us down the stairs and out onto the front lawn. We couldn't talk him into coming back inside. The previous owner's wife collected porcelain dolls. When she passed away years before, he put her collection into storage in the crawl space of the second bathroom. In the years since, they hadn't aged well. What the boyfriend saw was several lines of half-bald, half-molding white faces all staring at him. He wouldn't come back to the house until the dolls were gone. And even then, he wouldn't go anywhere near the stairs. Story 56. I was in East Germany, and we were exploring this house that we were told had been abandoned since World War II. The house was this huge 4-story tall place that was made of concrete and bricks mostly, I believe. Pretty spooky in general, and was almost entirely untouched inside by spray paint or anything. Had old wallpaper on the walls that I took a picture of. Looked like really weird children's animals, but it was in every room. Very odd. My OF, I'm out moment was when we got to the basement part of the house and found a door at the bottom. Keep in mind that this house was at least 75 years old and supposedly untouched for almost that long too. This door didn't fit that kind of description. It was this huge modern metal door. Unlike the rest of the house, it was super clean and looked like a bank vault door. It obviously wasn't from the house's original era, and I felt like I was somewhere I shouldn't have been. We all quickly ducked back out the back windows and left. To top the whole thing off, a few of us went back the next morning to see the thing in daylight, and the windows we climbed out of was covered with rubble. All the ground floor windows were actually. Sometime that night, the entire second story, and maybe the third, had dropped onto the first floor, and all the rooms we had explored that night, for all intents and purposes, non-existent. Wild stuff. I still have a picture of the wallpaper somewhere. Story 57. I have a few, including a really effed up time. I used to explore an old abandoned insane asylum. There was all kinds of crazy crap. It was many acres of property, including a coal power plant complete with steam tunnels to a bunch of buildings. One time, I was in a resident facility basement and found the mailroom. Well, I was on the resident side of the mailroom. Something about this place you have to understand is that they just up and left. Like everything was trashed, rooms of computers, desks as they were, sandwiches rotten as F in the break room. Well, anyway, I saw a letter in a box and said to my friend, "We need to get this." As we looked at each other, it sounded like someone smashed an F-ton of fluorescent light bulbs over our heads. We looked around and looked at each other and got the F out of there. Another time, I was in another building with 3 floors. Basement, burned section. I was way up near the attic hatch entrance when I heard one of the big steel doors in the basement slam shut. I had been in there many times before. You always knew when you weren't alone, but this was weird because I knew I was alone. I got the F out of there. The last time I'm going to write up, my friend from the story and I were in an office building where previously I found a hidden hatch that led to a stairwell to the attic. There were tons of crazy records, birth certificates, social security numbers, records of when they were restrained and what happened. It was wild to go through. Those were different times. They brought over Nazi doctors to experiment on the patients, and there were many stories of abuse. My friend and I walk in and immediately look to the right. Looks normal. We look to the left, and there's this thing next to the Coke machine. It's like a bundle of blankets or something. We shine the flashlight over, and it's a blanket with 2 feet sticking out the bottom. The body was bloated like crazy. My friend and I ran out so fast. Luckily, we were barely in. We went back about a week later and the whole building was boarded up. It looked like they had tried to cut a hole in the wall to remove the body. Story 58. Not a building, but this very old-fashioned mine, 1870, I think. Me and my 5 friends, it was like what you would expect for the most part, until we got to this very much open space. 10-ish foot drop. We dropped down and we had this lantern that was very bright but would only last 20 minutes. We turned it on. Then we saw human remains. 6 girls, 1 guy, brutally disassembled. Mostly rotten, looked like a few years they had been down there. But there was this one body, not disassembled. It was my crush that had been kidnapped 2 to 3 months back with very obvious signs of SA. We left instantly. Someone followed us home, we called the cops on them, and they were arrested for unaliving and SA and torture. We reported it. That area is now very off limits. Edit 1. I will not share where this is because it would be very easy to identify us. Edit 2. There were 3 of them that followed us home. Also, the reason the police showed up so quick is because my stepfather is a high-ranking policeman, so our house is on watch 24/7. Story 59. Here in Moscow, we have famous abandoned buildings called Hovrino Hospital that was never finished. In early 2010, it was this creepy place, which a bunch of creepypasta-like stories ranging from ghosts to cults that performed rituals here. Me and 3 of my friends' story takes place there. There was me, 13 years old, and my friend, who was the same age except for one guy who was 15 at the time. As a young stupid kid in Russia, we love do stupid and really dangerous crap, and we all finally decide to try and visit Hovrino Hospital that was not far from where we lived. Just take 30-minute ride on bus. We meet at 2 p.m. as always and embark on our one-day adventure. The hardest part, honestly, was get over the fence and don't meet guard on our way in and out, but our grown-up friend do so research and find some hole under the fence. If my memory's right, we entered southeast wing, true window, and start exploring. First hour was kinda uneventful for the most part, for exception of some cool and some creepy graffiti, and when our grown-up friend jumped from one side to another of elevator shaft, but when we get deeper into the hospital, that where we start slowly crapping pants. Barely any light from windows makes us really hard to see, plus one of our friends was kinda prankster who tried to scare us. But then we stopped and got all quiet, listening to the emptiness of building. And then we heard a terrible loud scream that echoed walls and corridors. What that was, we don't know. We was not that brave or stupid to try investigate in the dark, and just run as fast as we can, crapping ourselves in process. From that day, I'm personally not so enthusiastic to go and explore abandoned buildings, especially hospitals. P.S. Sorry for mistakes. Hey, he tried his best to write it, and I tried my best to read it, and I think somewhere along the way, we both failed. But mostly me, though. Story 60. My childhood friend and I made a habit of breaking into our other friend's old house after she moved out. They left the house in not great condition. The landlord didn't bother to clean it up. There were tons and tons of piles of toys to dig through, plus tons of movies. It was like a treasure hunt. Oh, and there was also a cat that lived there, which used to run away from us, but we started feeding it tuna until it started coming to us. I've always wanted a cat of my own, but couldn't have one because my family was allergic. I loved that cat. One day we showed up to see, for some reason, a brand new pair of jeans and a PlayStation controller, which definitely hadn't been there before. Meaning we weren't the only ones breaking into the house. So we noped the F out after that. It was not a good neighborhood, so there could be some drug dealers or gang members using the house. We were afraid they would unalive us to eliminate the witnesses if we kept going back. Story 61. Fantastic question. I was at the biggest abandoned building in my city on the top floor of the 8-story building. I'm 5'11". I had 3 friends with me, one 6'2" and the other 6'3". Part of the stairs were destroyed, so we had to hold the edge of the building to stretch into another doorway to continue. They were barely long enough, so it's a miracle I even made it in. But once we stepped in, it was pitch black, and I was standing on what I thought was a staircase, holding onto nothing, fishing for the next step with my foot. My friend turned on his flashlight. We were all standing on an I-beam. Nothing below us, just an 8-story drop. Story 62. We used to explore this underground cave under the city, which resembled a sewer but much tighter, about 5 foot high and fits 2 people horizontally. It had water flowing up to our ankles and it would go on forever. Every day we came back to try and finish the whole cave, adapting by using flashlights instead of candles, as the candle would die when we went deep. F no, moment number 1. We found a deviating path, and there was somebody's flashlight and an ID card, so we instinctively thought they got unalived there and all traces were meant to be abandoned. Moment 2. We found this draping web/slime structure from the ceiling of the cave and thought it was a human until we took a closer look. Moment 3. We arrived at what looked like the end of the cave. It continues into a smaller 3-foot-tall cave, but the end was a chamber bigger than the main cave, and there were weird ritualistic writings on the walls of the chamber. We ran home and did the 2-hour walk in less than 1 hour. Keep in mind that all this was pitch black if you didn't have a flashlight, so we never knew what we were getting into if we didn't point in the right direction. It felt very much like a horror game. Story 63. Not an abandoned building, but I saw something as a 12-year-old with my best friend at the time and a younger brother that still cannot be explained. My family lived right outside of Wilmington, Delaware at the time. Behind our backyard fence was a huge cornfield, and we would play there every day. We built forts and would shoot corn kernels at each other from slingshots. We were dumb, but soon found paintballing. Anyway, there was a few patches of woods in the cornfield, and we had explored every corner, occasionally coming across fire pits with toilet paper rolls and clothes scattered around. We once got chased from one of those spots by a crazy woman who looked like a junkie extra from The Wire. Well, one night we were out in the cornfield. There were tons of stars out and a very bright moon. Possibly full, can't totally remember. That was after harvest because there were no stalks obstructing our views. As we were walking and talking, we heard a loud rustling coming from the direction of the woods our fort was in. As the noise continued, our curiosity piqued, so naturally we started moving towards it. Again, we were idiots. As we moved in to about 50 yards away, when we saw what looked like a dog start to run on 4 legs parallel to us but maintaining the same distance, this thing was long but very slender, like the build of a Great Dane. Obviously, this spooked us and we began to retreat, backpedaling while continuing to face whatever this creature was. As we got to within 20 yards from my backyard fence, the creature stood up on 2 legs and started to run again as fast as it moved on 4 legs. We all just kind of stood there, staring but literally speechless. After a few seconds passed, I told them we need to climb the fence and haul Bud back home. At no point did it feel like a threat to us. It kept its distance, but it moved very swiftly. To this day, none of us have any effing clue what we saw, but we all agree we saw the same thing. We lived in a residential area not far from the city of Wilmington, so although it's possible it was a black bear, it moved so fast. And having lived in Colorado in the mountains, I've had many run-ins with bears. If anyone has any theories, I am open to it. It has been 20 years and I still don't know what the heck I saw. Story 64. I was killing time before the train and I walked past this old abandoned house. The street it's on is very public and right next to a popular canal walk. Well, I think to myself, F it, and I climb on right through the window at the front of the house. Some people saw me doing it, but I couldn't hear them properly, so I just gave them a wave and carried on through the window. So I climbed into the house through the living room window, and oh boy, that effort was dirty, dilapidated, and it smelt like crap. I'm standing there taking in the view of this abandoned building when 2 junkies walked from the hallway into the living room where I'm stood. They didn't notice me till I said hello. At that point, they proceeded to crap themselves and the guy drops what he had in his hand. The girl stands in shock and the guy's looking for what he dropped, all the while repeating the word loser. I ask what he's lost, and he tells me it's none of my business and that I owe him a tenor. Naturally, I tell him to go F himself, and the dude starts getting angry. I step towards him, and he pulls the girl in front of himself. There's a noise from the window I climb through, and I look back to see first a foot, then a leg, then finally a whole policeman appear. He asked me what I was up to, and I told him I was just having a look. He asks me if anyone else is there, and I turn to see the junkies are gone. Where I was stood, I could see the stairs and they were both huddled in the corner. I told the copper I was by myself. He asks me to leave, and I was given a $40 fine for trespassing. Saw the junkie girl a couple of years later. She came up to me asking for money before recognizing who I was. Her pal died not long after. Apparently, he had a knife on him, and after myself and policemen left, he kept talking about how he was going to stab me. The way I see it now is that I paid $40 not to get stabbed. To me, that's a pretty good deal. Story 65. My significant other and I snuck into this building that was said to have been a boys' school and mental home. On one side of the road, which is open and everyone goes to, it's covered in spray paint. You can find windows with bars and metal bed frames, broken pianos, and other eerie things that lay credence to those claims. Across the street is a locked fence with a long driveway going down to 2 buildings at the base of the mountain. The building on the right has been like half burned and the roof has fallen in, kind of like an old church. So we didn't go there, we went to the normal building on the left. The room we entered was huge, open floor plan, grass all over the floor, huge windows, and it was midday. So the room was actually super bright, which is important. We went through a few super bright rooms with cool graffiti, like, okay, this is cool. Then we come to a hallway which is straight pitch black. Blackest black, with something big hanging, swinging slightly in the darkness. You could vaguely see all the way down and a significant dripping sound. The dripping sound was what got us. It was like something out of a movie, and there was no wind or breeze going through, so it was just like, what is causing that thing to swing? And it's the middle of a bright day. How could it have possibly been so perfectly black? We kind of stood there and stared for a few minutes, waiting to see if the other person would be like, let's do this. But the longer we waited, the more it felt just scary standing there in front of it. Like if something spooky was down there, it could totally just snap us up. So we noped out of there. Story 66. Went to a long abandoned train depot in rural Virginia, sorta near Danville, with my friend a few months ago. The place was in the middle of effing nowhere. There was a small gravel pull-off where we parked and a very small rundown house on the other side of the tracks, but nothing else really around in the immediate area, and we were a good couple miles down a super rural back roads from 29. Anyway, we parked my little Honda Civic and this fat lady sitting on the porch of the house yells something at us. We couldn't hear her, so we just gave her a thumbs up. She gets on her cell phone and we pay no mind, because the cops are literally 30 plus minutes away, and we make our way into the building. The building is pretty lame. It's almost totally empty except for a few modern cabinets still with the Home Depot tags on them. Empty, just stacked in one room, but still sorta cool to see the old building. Eventually we find a door that leads to a super steep, narrow staircase that goes upstairs. Upstairs is one very large room with a door to a smaller room on the opposite end. We go into the room and find two modern-looking dressers, and when we opened the drawers, they were all completely filled with KKK robes and flags and stuff. We get out of there pretty fast, and by the time we get out of the building and are fighting our way through the chest-high brush to get back to the road, an OBS Ford Ranger with a bunch of rednecky dudes in the bed is pulling into the house driveway past my car, and they start yelling expletives at us. Keep in mind I was driving a lowered Honda Civic with a big spoiler, which clearly marked us as not from round these parts. And this was the kind of place that if a couple city boys went missing, nobody would find us. So we got the F out of there, and the truck followed us most of the way back to Danville, before we eventually lost them in traffic. Story 67. This wasn't an abandoned building story, but it did happen when I was exploring a sketchy area. Close by to my house was a local beach that was known for two things. It was a local hangout for high school kids, and it was also where sketchy people went to sell drugs and do God knows what else. It was very secluded and in a nice area. It was just the only real place in town where you could go swim in the river. My parents rarely let me go down there, even though it was a 1-minute bike ride away, but when I got into high school, I started doing whatever I wanted and didn't care anymore. So I went down by myself one day in sophomore year and biked around a bit. I had seen condoms and stuff there before, but this time when I got to the beach area, I found something that still bothers me to this day. It was a cut-off ponytail. It wasn't loose hair that had fallen out either. It was cut off by a pair of scissors or a knife. Now, is it possible someone got a redneck haircut on the beach? Yes, and it was probably the most likely scenario, but I still wonder whose ponytail it was. What a strange thing to find. Needless to say, I biked my butt out of there right away. Story 68. Me and my friends used to spend so much of our teenage years exploring stuff like this in the countryside and in our town. The main ones that I remember giving us the F this moment was an old, ransacked, abandoned barn in a rural part of the woods. When we all poked our heads round the barn door, it was a completely empty one, except for a single, rotting child's crib in the center of the barn. To make it creepier, there were also chains on the floor. We all agreed to get out of there and adventure in another direction. Another one was an old lorry depot at the edge of our town. It was completely locked off from the outside, so we ended up climbing on the building's roof to find a way in. We found a part of the roof that I guess was previously used for ceiling ventilation, but was now broken and big enough to squeeze through. When we turned our lights on in the new room we landed in, all we could see on the walls was graffiti of people crying, or people with black holes where their eyes should be, along with what looked like amateur, demonic symbols. I would say this was the scariest night we had, as we couldn't get back out the way we came, so we had to explore through the rest of the building. We got out eventually from the main lorry loading area using a chain pulley system that lifted up one of the shutters. We never went back, and that whole area was knocked down and is now luxury flats. Story 69. Was 19 at the time and went to the Homestead Asylum in Saratoga, New York. Nowadays, because it's so popular, cops patrol it daily. Get arrested on sight because it was closed down for asbestos. It was a group of us, about 8. The homestead was a tuberculosis center and the children's hospital. We were down in the morgue with cell phones, which at my time, the cool people had Motorola Razr phones. Anywho, we are down here exploring and the door shuts behind us. It's locked and we're inside the morgue. All the cell phones flicker and the lights go out and phones die suddenly. We hear this whispering sound and legitimately panicked. We ran down the hall into what looked like an office. We found a window, smashed it, and climbed out. We panicked more when the whispering was getting louder as if it was walking towards us. At this point, we were racing like heck to get to our cars. Surprisingly, our phones came back on at full charge, lights working again. I am not a ghost believer, but after that night, I started to believe about that differently. I still cannot explain to this day how all 8 phones died suddenly in that morgue. Clearly, someone or something didn't want us there. You know, I also don't believe in ghosts, but I would say I'm more of an open-minded skeptic. Like, it's gonna take some convincing, but something like that, and I would be convinced. Actually, if any of this happened to me, I'd be convinced. Story 70. Oh yeah, one more. Exploring the old SEPTA railway factory in North Philadelphia with a couple of friends. The place is absolutely huge and beautiful. We were dumb and hopped up on weed and Adderall at the time, and as we were about to walk through a door leading into a bigger part of the building, I looked through a hole in the wall and was certain that I saw a man on the other side, laying down on his stomach with a pistol aimed at the door. We sat there frozen for like 20 minutes, only to realize I was somehow hallucinating the whole thing and was in fact looking at a pair of old boots and some clothes behind a knocked over table. I don't know, I've never hallucinated like that before, but really weird. Anyways, after we finally went through the door, we were standing in a hallway that went forward to the left and formed a square perimeter on the outside of the building. The inside of the building was completely hollow, and you could see all the way across to the other side. That's when we saw a group of like 7 or 8 people emerge from the shadows, and they immediately started yelling and chasing us around the perimeter of the building. Luckily, we made it out, never going back there again. Story 71. My then boyfriend and I went exploring an abandoned high school in the tiny Alabama town where my parents live. Had fun picking through the decaying remains of what turned out to have been the last segregated high school in the area, maybe the state. I forget, we found a couple of ancient textbooks, an old toy truck, some neat graffiti, the usual. When we got to what seemed to be the old auditorium, gymnasium, whatever, we let ourselves in. And when the door closed behind us, it was pitch black in there. Couldn't see a thing. Us, being stupid, invincible 20-somethings, still thought this was just good fun, up until we hear a deep, male voice from somewhere else in the room say very firmly, "Get out." Say no more sounds fair to us, off we effed. A few days later, authorities found a dismembered corpse in that room. Pretty sure we walked in on a body being carved up. Story 72. Not abandoned, just an empty, unused house. It used to be the house of my friend's grandparents, which passed away, if I remember correctly. We were teens and the hookah, narwhal, water pipe was very popular back then, so we decided to go smoke my brand new hookah and have some drinks there to hide from our parents. The house had 2 stories. The top floor was packed with boxes. You could go up the stairs to the second floor, but you could not enter easily because of the boxes. We were chilling, sitting legs crossed on the carpeted floor on the first floor in the living room, and all of a sudden, the kitchen door, the door didn't have a knob or a lock. It was the kind that you just push to open, blasts open, as if someone had punched it to come inside the living room. Immediately after that, we clearly heard someone going up the stairs really, really fast. By the way, the stairs were beside the kitchen door and in front of us, but we couldn't see anyone, and when it reached the second floor, it ran through the hall. Remember, it was packed with boxes, and the footsteps suddenly stopped. We just stared at each other for like a second and bolted out of the house so fast that we flipped over the hookah with the lit up coal. Panicked, I grabbed the hookah and the coal with my hands to get it out of the house and got a real bad burn. We never returned to that place again. Story 73. Went to a pretty big abandoned indoor swimming pool which never got finished. It still lies lonely in the woods because the project was stopped about 30 years ago, and nobody did care about it anymore. Entered through a small garage, a mattress was there surrounded by pretty fresh feces and trash. The smell was horrible, of course, but the dolls and adult film mags were pretty unsettling. It just felt like someone was there as I entered further into the complex. I couldn't grasp the feeling. It It was unsettling and I felt like being watched, although pretty unlikely. As I went to the cellar, it was pitch dark. I was standing in knee-deep water because the rainwater had gathered there and couldn't float off through the concrete. I followed a few corridors, and when my light illuminated a wall, I knew it was time to go. There stood, "The owls are not what they seem," a Twin Peaks quote. My gut told me to get lost, so I did. I don't even like to look at the photos I got. Everything felt strange. Story 74. My entire family has farmland, and we frequently go out to visit them at all times of the year. Just randomly, but also on holidays. When I was a kid, maybe 15 or 16, we explored the woods next to my uncle's house. We were having a great time jumping over dead logs, swinging on vines. My brother broke his butt on rocks because a vine broke, lol, running through his cornfield, etc. We ended up finding an abandoned barn out there, and we were like, OMG, secret base? Secret base! This time around, we had brought walkie-talkies with us, so that we could all communicate between the house and woods. That way we could bring out drinks or food to anyone who wanted or needed it. We told our siblings inside, I have a lot of siblings, okay, what we had found. Little did we know, our uncle had heard and told us to stay out of it. We were too far out of range to know because we had run on ahead to explore it. It was super small and empty. No animals had built nests or anything in it. There weren't even spider webs, which obviously now we find that odd. There was a room where you would keep food, tax supplies where the door wouldn't stay closed unless you locked it from the outside. It was super dark inside, which was weird because the sun was out and there were holes in the wall. We ignored it. Climbed up into the loft. We're having a great time when boom, the door to the only room downstairs slams open. I'm petrified at that point. The door was pretty secure with no way to open it unless it was from the outside. I peed my pants. There was something about what had just happened that terrified me. We effing jumped out of that loft and bolted. Never went back. Turns out a Civil War soldier who deserted hung himself in that barn. Pretty sure we were disturbing the death site of an active ghost. Story 75. Many years ago, there was an abandoned water filtration plant in St. Charles County, Missouri, that local kids referred to variously as the Aquadome, Equidome, Equidome. It was a collection of buildings used during World War II in conjunction with a nearby munitions plant. In 1989, a boyfriend and I went exploring the place. I loved abandoned buildings, so he suggested we go, and this was all very exciting. This was, of course, the ubiquitous pentagrams, graffiti, questionable dead animals, and references to Satan, but I was mainly interested in the architecture and industrial remnants. Apart from some structural safety issues, not much scared me until I reached a spot with a meter-square hole in the concrete floor, with "Hell" scrawled above it in red spray paint with a downward-pointing arrow. I laughed off the cliche until I crouched down and shone my flashlight into the abyss below. There, in the dark, about 15 feet down, was some standing water covered in what looked like to be hundreds upon hundreds of bright orange puffballs about the size of baseballs. I took one glance and noped the F out of there so fast it made my head spin. Found my boyfriend Jason nearby and had him take a look. He too noped the F out. This was a 6'4" fearless punk rock dude that people generally didn't mess with. We left after that. Today, the Equidome is long gone, and the area has been leveled and turned into a police shooting practice range. To this day, I wonder what the heck I saw down there. Some kind of fungus? Strange mystery apparatus used in water treatment? Aliens? No one knows. Story 76. Me and a friend took a shortcut while walking at night and came to a really neat park. It had a playground, monkey bars, seesaws, and other crazy contraptions, and had large walls running parallel on the other side with a crappy metal fence toward the way back that led to a canal. Kinda like a cul-de-sac or a funnel. It was dimly lit, but kinda nice. So we stayed and goofed off for a while and started coming here on the weekends thereafter, always at night for some reason. There was an abandoned apartment complex on one end, and a row of really old houses that might as well just be abandoned that made the park feel so isolated. But we liked it, so we kept coming back. One night we were both chilling quietly. I was lying on the bench and he on the grass, and we heard noise. It was maybe 2 or 3 a.m. and we knew people didn't live in the complex and it was too late for the people who lived in the houses to be out, so we grew alert. We heard mumbling, but the park was too dim to see anyone. We stayed quiet and we heard it again on the other side of the park. There was grass, but we didn't hear footsteps. We both started freaking out a little, but after a couple of times it just stopped. We waited a couple of minutes and bolted. We were so curious the next day that we went back in the morning to check it out. When we got there, we realized we've never been here during the day, and I could have sworn it seemed there were more trees at night. One of the walls had a few cinder blocks missing, so we peeked to the other side and realized that it was a cemetery. My friend got a little spooked thinking about what had happened the day before and started walking around until he stepped on a large piece of flesh on the ground. We checked it out, and it looked like a thick femur with some meat still attached. We both got spooked and started to walk away, wondering if it could have been a human or animal, when we noticed more flesh on the grass. Intestines this time. Upon realizing there was more, we widened our field of scope and found more stuff. A small pouch with an eye, kidneys, a heart, and a pig's head all around the park right where we were hearing the noises. We never came back. Story 77. This happened maybe 4 years ago. Not a building, but a graveyard in an old abandoned coal town called Red Ash. This place is notoriously haunted, and there are multiple stories, sightings of apparitions and paranormal activity in the area. There's multiple legends about a graveyard of child coal miners, a woman who cries over her grave every night, the spirits of coal miners walking along the train tracks, a witch's shack, and a demonic goat man, among other things. There's legit so many stories about this place, and if you ask anyone in my area, they'll tell you all about it. Most people actually avoid this area because of the stories, but mostly because it's on a back road with one-lane bridges and potholes. But not dumb teens, and my friends and I just so happened to have been dumb teens. So one night I was driving around with a couple of friends when we started talking about the place. Friend A and I had never been there, so friend B insisted we go right then. This place is like a 30-ish minute drive from where we all live, so friend and I were like, yeah, sure, let's go. So we drive all the way out in the deep neck of the woods in a tiny 2-door Mini Cooper with the intention of finding all the legends, starting with the graveyard. We never got past the graveyard. We all got out of the car once we found the graveyard and started looking around for any signs of the paranormal. All of us jumpy as heck because it's like 2 a.m. We keep hearing footsteps in the woods, probably Goat Man, and the only adequate light we had was our phone flashlights. We try to take our time, and I split off from our terrified group huddle to look around. Friend A and B are looking around one side of the graveyard, and I make my way to the other. Note, the graveyard is very small. We were maybe 20 feet from each other when we were roaming around. It was mostly us saying stuff like, "Found anything yet? Just this baby snake. Ew, no, keep that over there." But then I noticed this set of 2 twin headstones that are very old, and the writing on them is weathered, but otherwise are still standing. They were particularly interesting because they were twin stones, probably a couple. They were about 1 foot wide and 3 feet tall, both on one base, so these stones were close to 4 feet in height. Most of the stones were in ground or very small headstones. As I said before, mostly the stones of children or the poor. I circled the base of the headstones, starting at the front. I came back around and began to walk away when the left stone literally breaks in half and falls towards me. It hits the ground with a loud thump, which is what alerted me to the stone having fallen. It was a horizontal break, but these stones had no cracks, and I didn't touch the stone in the slightest. I jump, turn, and scream at the same time. Both friend A and friend B scream. Friend A whips around to see what happened while friend B just guns it straight to the car. I also began running, grabbing friend A so B doesn't decide to drive off without us. Friend B dives headfirst into the back seat from the passenger side. Friend A jumps into the driver's side, and I throw the front seat backwards and hop in while B's legs are still hanging out the door, now trapped between the seat and the door frame. We drive off with the passenger door still open, and I'm holding it closed as we'll let go of B's legs still hanging out. As we're driving, I pull my seat up so B can actually get into the car. I'm laughing my butt off now that I'm thinking about this again. We're all traumatized, shook even. But now we're filled with questions and gushing with adrenaline. So we do the stupid thing of turning around and going back to the graveyard to find that the top half of the stone is completely missing now. There was maybe 10 minutes between us leaving and coming back, and in that time the piece of the tombstone that broke off has completely disappeared. We decide we've had enough and leave for the night. We've went back a few times after that, and it's always spooky, but we've never had quite the encounter as our first visit. I actually plan to buy some cheap ghost hunting equipment and have those friends go back out with me, because this place is a gold mine of spooks. Also, if anyone actually read this far, thanks for reading. Story 78. My friend and I, both females, were 14 years old at the time, exploring an abandoned house in a small town that neighbors the town in which I live. My mom had driven us there since it was quite a far walk from any nearby occupied houses, well over 8 miles at least. So this tiny town was abandoned back in the 70s when it was supposed to be flooded to create a large reservoir. The government kicked everyone out of their homes and only a few families stood their ground and refused to leave. A few are still living there to this day, but most houses in the town are now abandoned, boarded up and falling apart. The families that once lived there left most of their personal belongings behind because they were so rushed to leave, even though the project never went through. So furniture and things of that nature were left behind in most cases. Lots of the houses have been partied in or graffitied to crap. So many items of furniture were thrown from windows and scattered all over the properties. I've thoroughly explored most of them, but there was one that really got the hairs standing on the back of my neck. My friend and I entered this house in the middle of the day sometime in early summer, so it was warm, probably somewhere in the 60 to 70 degree range. We went upstairs, and I went in one room to the right of the staircase, and she went to the one on the left. Mind you, all the windows are broken and there are small holes forming in the floors. She called me in the other room, sounding a bit startled, and I went to see what she had found. She found a bed neatly made, with fresh sheets, not from the 70s, from present day, just very dirty, and a closet full of clothes, all on hangers. Big no thanks. We both turned right around and never went back. I tried to find the house years later just to point it out to a friend for proof that it was where I said it was, and I couldn't find it. It might have been torn down, or I just went to visit it when it was so overgrown and I didn't see it, but that was so very odd. I can only assume someone was squatting in there, but man, it is such an unsafe place to live. Story 79. Was going through a really old abandoned house once, which had some cool art in it. Knowing how butterfingers I get when I'm nervous, I made the choice to leave my phone in the car. And besides, we were in the middle of a deep farmland, so anyone who was going to approach us would need a light. Therefore, we'd see him. I'm walking through, and I think I see a flash of light out of the corner of my eye, and ask everyone if they'd seen it as well. The consensus was that nothing flashed, and it was dark enough with only our glow sticks for light that we'd have seen it. 5 minutes later, we're in the basement admiring some paintings. We all hear it, the rustling of a person crawling in through the same window we all crawled through. I began to think the friend we'd left behind was trying to catch up and had changed his mind. None of us moved except me to move closer to what must have been a closet. I tucked myself in and listened to the steps getting closer to the top of the stairs and then down them. F this, I thought, and called out, "Hey, who is that?" and heard, "Sheriff's Department, come on over here." We all got off with warnings because all we brought were glow sticks and a couple of us had wallets. Apparently, it's a historic monument and they're having to tear it down because it got so tore up by people over the years, and there were a lot of addicts using and living in it during winter. So this small town had a sheriff who just pretty much watches it constantly and calls in for help if he needs it. Story 80. A friend and I explored an old, dilapidated Rockefeller mansion hidden in the woods once before it became patrolled by authorities and super duper off limits. The house was pretty uneventful. It was just really cool to compare photos of it when it was livable versus how it looked in present day on Google. Plus, it was super cool being in an old mansion of a famous family. The Rockefellers no longer owned the property. However, behind the house, it had a carriage house with living quarters upstairs. While we were in there, we kept hearing scuffling around on the floors. It was probably a rodent, but it sure was scary at the time to be alone in a building and hear walking in other rooms. I'm going to share a link to the location because the author has photos so you can see what I'm talking about. But no, it is extremely off limits now and you will get in big trouble if you go there. So I suggest not going there if you live in the area. Also, not my article. I know the difference between soldiers and airmen. I did thank Percy for letting me explore his houses when I left. I don't know why since he wasn't there, obviously, but I figured it was respectful if his spirit was there to recognize that it was his home and I was a visitor. Story 81. I have friends who like doing the whole explore old abandoned buildings thing. I'm generally a nervous person, so I don't really enjoy going with them. Regardless, one time we were all hanging out and one of them was driving and we saw this old abandoned gas station looking thing along the highway at night. And they were all like, "Let's go!" So we stopped to go check it out, even though I was reluctant. We found a broken window in the back, went in, and saw what you would typically expect: beer cans, condoms, graffiti on the walls, junk lying around and whatnot. We go into the next room, which was about the same, and then the next, which was still about the same. Then we walked into the next room, and it truly felt like a movie moment, because we were looking around with our flashlights and someone shined it over on a wall where we saw a pentagram or something that looked very similar. Then they immediately shined it on the ground where a dead animal was lying, size of a big cat or raccoon, with the top half of its body present but decomposing, and the lower half was straight up skeleton. Like someone cut all the muscle and fur off the lower half just to have a skeleton or something, or maybe another animal just ate it? Regardless, it looked like some weird ritual, and we bounced out of there so fast. Story 82. My story doesn't quite fit the requirements because I wasn't exploring, but I love to tell it. So, I was a university student on summer break in the 1980s and got a job from the local student job search. It involved cleaning up some hot tubs that had been dirtied when the building they were in caught fire. Turned out the building was a massage parlor, i.e. a brothel, and it caught fire when the opposition firebombed it. Anyway, I spent an afternoon cleaning these hot tubs. Somewhere I still have one of their advertising flyers that were lying everywhere. I was quite impressed that they'd used this Aubrey Beardsley drawing of Lizzie Strada on it. A few weeks later, the owners contacted me and asked me if I wanted to do another job in the building, cleaning out the food that had been in the freezer and was now rotting. I took some gloves, and when I get there, this beautiful employee gave me rubbish bags and a torch and showed me where the kitchen was. It was at the back of the building, and it was pitch dark. Everything was burnt and had been soaked when they put the fire out. There's a huge mound of rotting chickens on the floor that had been dumped out of the freezer. I pick up the first one and my fingers just went through the flesh and it fell apart. It just felt so wrong, and it was covered in bugs. I looked closer, and the whole pile of chickens was just a huge writhing mass of bugs. There were so many you could hear them moving. I ended up finding a metal shelf and using that to shovel the chickens and bugs into the bags. I took one 5-minute break for fresh air, but I knew I couldn't afford any more or I'd never go back in. We're talking so many bugs they would have filled several buckets. I eventually got the job down, and the beautiful employee gave me a lift to a friend's house so I could have a shower. She made me wind down the window though, because I stunk so bad. To add insult to injury, they were really slow to pay up, and I had to go down and wait at their other brothel alongside their clients. Story 83. Long story short, but the day before, I woke up in Russia with a bottle of gin in my left hand and a bottle of Jägermeister in my right hand, and a bottle of vodka in one of my back pockets. My friend was on the roof next to the building I was on. The day before that started in Norway. Both me and my friend have no idea how we got into Russia. We didn't have our passport on us, and we didn't have our visas either. So after we call some friends to come pick us up, we say bye to the Russia people we apparently had partied with and started walking around. As the buildings around us started looking more run down, we found a factory/mining building looking structure and decided to explore while we waited. As we enter on the second floor and walk around, we start hearing people talking in Russian. No idea what they said. And as we enter an open room which looks down into the large central room in the middle of the building, we see a ton of Russians. Either they didn't see us up there, or they might just not have cared. As we look down on the Russians, they bring in another guy which they have place on his knees. One man steps forward towards the guy and starts talking loudly in Russian, and everyone shuts up. He talks for a minute or two and then looks at the rest of the Russians. They all vote by thumbs up or thumbs down. When the talker is finished counting the thumbs, says 2 words, pulls out a gun, and shoots the guy on his knees. Me and my friend, panicked, scared AF, leave the building as fast as quiet as we have ever been. When we get out, we start running faster than Usain Bolt for a solid 6+ minutes. I don't even remember how far away we ran. Story 84. I'm late to the party, but I have a good one. Back in college, on the walk home from our favorite bar was an abandoned church. It was a deceptively big building. At street level, it looked like a normal single-story building, but because it was built on the side of a huge hill, it was more like a 5-story building. There was even an attached house which nuns used to live. It had started to become a weekend ritual that we would close down the bar on our drunken walk home, break into the church to explore a bit. The nearby Cincinnati Zoo had purchased the property years before with the intent of tearing it down and building a parking lot. During a few of our explorations, we would find some of their crap they were storing there. Christmas decorations, animal costumes, and we even found a huge box of glow necklaces that they must have sold during their Festival of Lights. Fast forward a few weekends later, a few of us are drunk and we're exploring further than we ever have. It's 3 a.m. and we're in the belly of the beast, 5 floors down into some maze-like area when we walk into a room and a single glow necklace is laying there, shining green and bright, as if someone had just cracked it open. We weren't alone, but I didn't see or hear anyone. We said F this and bolted and went to get Skyline Chili. Skyline Chili, you heal all wounds. Story 85. Not as exciting as the other stories told here, but last New Year's, me and my friends decided to go into an abandoned house we'd been frequenting. We came there on occasion to just drink and have fun for the thrill of it. This time we brought some girls who hadn't been there before. We came in through the back door and went up towards the roof using the staircase. Whilst walking up, I looked at a weird-looking door and said to one of the girls, "Dang, that totally looks like a room where they would perform demonic rituals or something." After we had some fun on the second floor, we decided to leave, obviously using the staircase again. My other friends had been to the house a few more times than me. I'd been like twice, and I was curious about the room behind the door. So whilst the girls and one of my 2 friends were already at the ground floor, I asked my other friend, "Hey, have you ever checked this room before?" He answered with a no, and we were both curious. So we decided to slowly open the door. The first alarm sign was that when he opened the door, we saw some light, so we were instantly freaked out and glued to the ground. Next thing he sees is something moving on the couch in the room, so we bolted out of there screaming, "Get out!" to the others. Once we were outside, we realized it was just 2 homeless people sleeping there, and the movement was one of them getting up from their sleeping bags. So it wasn't that weird. I could have told this story with less words, but it was a thrilling experience to me, so I told it the way I felt at the moment. Sorry if it's too long. Story 86. Okay, so me and 2 buddies went to an old abandoned house in the countryside. It was about to be torn down. 2 of us had eaten mushrooms. The other guy was babysitting. Got into the house, and it felt like late fall, early winter maybe, and cold. We had the bright idea to start a small fire to keep warm on the second story. House provided enough wood and tinder to get a comfortable little fire going. We are all bullcrapping and tripping for about a half hour. Maybe. It's fun. Then I start to feel like things are crawling on me. Not something I'm unfamiliar with, as this wasn't my trip. Sober guy was somewhere else in the house. I ignore the crawlies and relax by the fire. Slowly notice my buddy scratching at the invisible crawlies. I comment on how the shrooms have given me the crawlies. Buddy says the same. Look down at my hands. Bees. Look up at the hole where the light fixture is. An F-ton of bees are pouring out of the hole directly above the fire and raining down on our drugged up, ignorant faces. We freak out. Babysitter comes back into the room and sees us freaking out, high, covered in bees. Toss the fire out of the window, bail out of the house, luckily with no stings thanks to the smoke. Tripped balls in the woods for a couple more hours after that, though. Oh, not the bees! Not the bees! You guys know that Nicolas Cage movie? Story 87. Used to explore a lot of old factories in the former GDR and have a lot of stories to tell. There are more dangers than just getting caught or hurting yourself. Back in the days, a lot of chemicals were used to keep buildings warm in winter or to make them fire resistant. One material is asbestos, which you'd find everywhere. The very moment you see broken asbestos, you have to get the F out of there as fast as you can. If you breathe small particles, there's a high chance of developing cancer and eventually dying. But that's just a quick disclaimer for everyone trying to explore abandoned buildings. My favorite story happened on the Soviet military site that was also used during the Second World War and had the lovely name Adolf Hitler Lager. It's now called Forst Zinna for anyone who's trying to look it up. One can say that Forst Zinna is like a big abandoned city in the forest near my hometown. In one house, we went to the upper floor to find a room that was decorated like a child's room with a big children's bed in the middle. It didn't look that old, but not really new either, because it had a rotten mattress and dirty blankets on it. Not to mention the human feces in the corner of the room and the smell. We kinda just stood there and nobody said anything when there was a distant sound of a door being shut aggressively. In that moment, I thought I was daydreaming of how much this was similar to a horror movie. We started running away from the sound. Luckily, there were 2 doors in that room so we could escape. Once we were outside of the building, we climbed up the wall, took our bikes, and drove away rapidly. I often think about that incident, as the main road here to drive to Berlin is located directly on the side of Forst Zinna. There are a lot of rumors and old stories about ghosts there, etc., because of how many people were executed there, and it's even said that if you drive by Forst Zinna at night, you can sometimes see a light in the old general's building. Thinking about it, it was probably just a guard of Forst Zinna keeping intruders away, but the whole scenery was just super weird. This was 2 years ago, and it kinda haunts me to this day. If you want, just search Forst Zinna on Google and look at some pictures. Maybe this will help understand my story. Story 88. Terminal 1 at Heathrow Airport is no longer used, and except for the odd surface maintenance man or for baggage engineering, it is deserted. I used to work there several years ago for an airline. I was walking through the abandoned terminal, which is heavily security restricted, to an area of the terminal which has further security access. Imagine a whole airport terminal to yourself. Minimal lighting, vast areas of space where restaurants and thousands of passengers used to inhabit. Anyway, I walked to a section of the terminal that was where the waiting areas are for boarding pre-flight. This led to a series of old air bridges. These are vast, long steel tubes that lead to a dead end. All of the conveyor belts are decommissioned. No artificial light, just the old window that hasn't been filled in. I walked around one of the long, dim-lit air bridges and saw a figure squatting in the floor about 150 meters from me. I called out. The figure turned to look at me, got up and started to walk away very quickly from me and turned a corner. I called out again, knowing that there was a security restrictions for the area. I gave chase. The figure sped up. I ran the 150 meters. I turned to the corner and came to the dead end. It was blocked off where the planes used to meet the air bridge. The person disappeared. Either they were hiding or were meters away from me, watching and waiting for me to turn my back. I got out of there fairly quickly and talked to a few lads back at base. They told me the tunnels were haunted by a baggage handler that died when he fell off the end of an air bridge onto the tarmac. I've not been back since. Story 89. My friends and I were exploring a derelict warehouse plant on government property that used to be used for prison labor. It's technically on the same parcel of government land as a prison, but it's a fairly large area of land which is mostly unused, so we weren't too worried about running into anyone or getting in trouble. Well, while we were wandering around, we heard the sound of a truck approaching. The room we were in had 2 open cargo bay doors facing the dirt road outside, so we all scrambled to hide. The closest spot I found to get out of sight was to press myself against the wall in the thin space right between the 2 open doors. The truck stopped right on the other side of the wall and sat there for a few seconds that felt like an eternity before they drove away again. We left as soon as we couldn't hear the truck anymore. Didn't stop us from going back though. Story 90. Grew up in Russia, near a gated military town with lots of abandoned buildings. We would sneak into it through a hole under the fence and go explore. Creepiest or most unsettling one? A high school that was bombed during the war, so about a third of the structure's upper floors were gone. In the basement, we found a message written in big block letters. For other missing persons, go to address at a nearby major town. It was creepy to think about what must have transpired in there. We figured it must have been used as a location where people would come in to identify bodies. In another abandoned structure near that school, we found what I can only describe as a human nest. Basically a pile of rags to sleep on and a bucket for, bathroom needs. There was some fresh bread that was gnawed on nearby. We noped out rapidly before the nest's inhabitant would return. We've never seen any homeless people anywhere in that area, so who knows what that person's deal was. Abandoned sanatorium also seemed to be completely abandoned. We were poking around until we walked in on a man sleeping in one of the rooms. Noped out quickly as well. Story 91. I was exploring an abandoned movie theater when I was 14 with a group of kids who had already been through the place the day before. It was dark out because no good exploring happens in the daylight, and I had no flashlight. After exploring the seating area, we went up this stairwell, and about halfway up there was a landing and a doorway. I opened the doorway and went to step into what I assumed was maybe the projection room, and a guy grabbed me from behind. He was one of the kids who'd explored the place the day before. The door opened up to nothing, just a drop down, no floor. Just a door off the stairwell. It seemed like it was an empty elevator shaft for context. The projection room was another flight of stairs up, but I didn't wander any further. I still have no idea why that door existed, what it was for, or why it wasn't boarded shut, etc. But I am grateful those kids did a reconnaissance mission the day prior, or I'm certain this story would be a true crime podcast about a missing kid that turned up dead in the basement of an abandoned theater. Too long didn't read, almost plummeted to my death through a random door in a stairwell in an abandoned movie theater. Plenty more abandoned building stories like this one, a perk to growing up in a ghost town. Story 92. This isn't a building, but a tunnel, so my story may not count. Near my house, there's this abandoned tunnel that runs under one of the main roads and connects one neighborhood to another. In order to get to the tunnel on my side of the road, you have to pass this little park and the witch's gazebo before walking for a couple of minutes through the woods. The neighborhood on the other side is made of well-to-do people, so for Halloween, people would use the tunnel to get to the wealthy neighborhood for bags of chips and king-sized candy bars. One year, I was with my sibling and a couple of their friends when we stupidly decided to cross under into the wealthy neighborhood and get some good candy. We made the climb up the hill, got around to the gazebo, and got to the entrance of the trail when I just froze. My sibling and their friends noticed I wasn't following and tried to get me walking again, but I refused, and all but physically forced them to turn around and make the trek back to my house. For the life of me, I can't explain what happened, or even really comprehend why I stopped in the first place. Since that night, I've never doubted my instincts. Am I missing something? Wait, I don't understand why this is a good thing. Nobody got to get to the rich neighborhood and collect all the king-size candy bars? Story 93. Spent the night exploring an abandoned mausoleum, due to be torn down the next morning. I was alone, increasingly tired and a little bit spooked. When I got to the basement level, it was late, and I was tired. But as I came to the doorway of a room, I could hear a slight whirring sound coming from within. This was odd, since all the electricity had been cut off to the building. But I walked through the doorway and saw some giant mutant space worm with its mouth wide open come slithering toward me. It only took a second, but was a moment of extreme clarity. Brain. Rejecting this information, check again. Eyes. Yes, just double checked. It's definitely a huge metallic space worm undulating our way. Glance. Is this fight or is this flight? What are we doing here? Quick! Brain. Everyone, hold your positions. This is flatly impossible. There's no such thing as giant space worms. Eyes, can you triple check? Is there anything at all that might account for it? Eyes. Well, actually, the whirring sound was a breeze that was coming in from somewhere and causing some really large metallic foil tubing used for ductwork to undulate back and forth on the floor. I just stood in the doorway looking at it for 15 seconds or so, saying this is cool, very cool, not scary at all. I am a rational person and I don't freak out. Well done. But I didn't actually walk into that room, and about 3 to 4 minutes later, I felt a pent-up surge of endorphins flooding through my system that my body couldn't hold back any longer. Story 94. There was this house that was maybe a half mile or so from my house when I was a kid that was condemned. It didn't have any doors in it, and most of the windows were also falling apart, and the floor was full of holes. A friend would go with me when I wanted to explore it just for fun. We visited there a number of times. Behind the house was a pretty large yard that almost looked like a small field. It was so large, so sometimes we'd go through the house and play in the back for fun. It always seemed pretty harmless and no one was ever there. However, one day when we went, because I was trying to actually impress my friend's sister, we were too young to think about not dating each other's siblings back then, and I know he had a thing for my sisters, we all went to the house. Everything was pretty normal. We went through the house, to the backyard, and were just messing around, when suddenly my friend's sister, let's call her Jessie, noticed a tent in the back part of the field. We obviously went to go and check it out because it hadn't been there before. It wasn't zipped up, so we didn't think anyone would be there. However, we also couldn't see into the tent because the shade from a tree made it look darker along that side of the yard than the rest of it. I decided to peek into the tent to see if anything was in there. And there was. A man who looked maybe 6 feet tall and homeless was sleeping in that tent. I turned white and tried to leave without making a noise, but I was so shocked, I accidentally kicked part of the tent as I was turning around to signal to my friends to go back through the house and leave. It didn't fall over, but it made enough noise that the guy inside started to sit up. I yelled to my friends to run as fast as they could to get out, and by the time the guy woke up enough to get out of the tent and see us, we were already inside the abandoned, condemned house. We managed to avoid all the holes despite our panicked state, thankfully. I looked back to see if he was chasing us, and he wasn't, but he was standing still and staring at us like we did something wrong. Needless to say, we never went back there again, and I never explored another abandoned house ever again. I mean, he was probably just staring at you because you woke him up. But guys, that concludes our spooky abandoned building stories. Hope you enjoyed it. I'm sorry that I'm sick with COVID, so everything's very nasally, and I'm probably breathing way too heavy, but I hope you had fun nevertheless. And if you have any scary abandoned building stories, feel free to comment them down below. Thanks for watching.